I locked your credit card to teach you some financial discipline, my husband announced over the phone while his mother chimed in to remind me I was living on their charity. I did not argue or beg or cry. I simply smiled at the cashier, walked out of the bridal boutique, and drove straight to my private wealth manager. 1 hour later, my phone lit up with 44 missed calls from my husband and 3 frantic voicemails from his boss. They were about to learn exactly whose charity they had been living on. The scent of vanilla and expensive silk filled the air inside the Buckhead Bridal Boutique. My best friend was getting married in 3 weeks, and I had just found the perfect crystal hair vine to complete her ensemble. It was a modest $300. I handed my card to the young cashier, returning her warm smile as she slid the plastic through the terminal. The machine emitted a sharp, flat beep. The cashier frowned and tried again. Another beep. "I am so sorry," she murmured, her eyes dropping to the counter in polite embarrassment. "It says the card has been restricted." Before I could even reach into my purse for another form of payment, my cell phone began to vibrate violently in my hand. The caller ID flashed with Julian, my husband of 5 years. I swiped to answer, expecting him to ask if I was picking up dinner. Instead, his voice came through the speaker, dripping with a cold, calculated arrogance that immediately froze the blood in my veins. "Put it back, Maya," he ordered without so much as a greeting. "I get alerts the second a transaction hits our joint account. I locked the card while you were standing at the register. I locked it to teach you some discipline." I stood completely still, the ambient classical music of the boutique suddenly sounding like a mocking soundtrack. "Julian," I said, keeping my voice meticulously even, "I am buying a wedding gift. Unlock the card." A sharp, condescending laugh echoed through the receiver, but it did not belong to my husband. It belonged to Valerie, his mother. She had been listening on speakerphone the entire time. "You are living in our world now," Maya. Valerie sneered, her tone layered with years of barely concealed disdain. "We raised Julian to be a provider and a leader, but we did not raise him to fund a charity case from South Atlanta. You bring nothing to this marriage but a freelance hobby that barely pays for your own groceries. You need to respect the man providing your lifestyle. Ask us before you spend a dime of my son's hard-earned money." The cashier pretended to organize a stack of receipts, desperate to look anywhere but at my face. The humiliation was designed to be public. Julian and Valerie thrived on this kind of psychological warfare. Julian was a junior partner at a high-end wealth management firm. He made $150,000 a year, a respectable salary that he treated like a billionaire U.S. fortune. From the day we met, he loved playing the savior, the successful man who scooped up a struggling girl and gave her a comfortable life. And for 5 years, I let him believe that fantasy. I swallowed my pride. I shrank my presence, and I played the role of the humble, supportive wife to protect his incredibly fragile ego. "You need to understand the value of $1. Julian added, his voice swelling with unearned authority. "Go home, Maya. We will discuss your budget when I get off work." I looked down at the plastic card in my hand. It was a secondary card tied to his account, a physical leash. I had spent half a decade depositing a tiny, carefully calculated allowance into that joint account from my freelance brand consulting business, just to make him feel like the undisputed head of the household. "Understood," I said softly. I ended the call without another word. I did not throw a tantrum. I did not dissolve into tears. I simply turned to the cashier, offered a genuine apology for the inconvenience, and walked out of the boutique into the sweltering Atlanta afternoon. The heat hit me the moment I stepped onto the pavement, but internally I had never felt colder. I walked to the practical, understated sedan Julian had picked out for me because he said it was sensible. I sat in the driver's seat, locked the doors, and unzipped the hidden interior compartment of my handbag. I reached past the lip gloss and the car keys and pulled out a solid metal black card. It was heavy, cool to the touch, and bore no spending limit. Valerie and Julian thought I was a freelancer surviving on their benevolence. They had no idea that the brand consulting business I started in my 20s had pivoted years ago. They had no idea that while Julian was bragging about his junior partnership, I was quietly acquiring commercial real estate across the Southeast. They had no idea that I was the sole founder and majority shareholder of Apex Holdings, a private equity firm that practically owned the skyline they looked at every day from their office windows. I had hidden my wealth because the one time I tried to celebrate a minor business victory early in our marriage, Julian had sulked for a week, punishing me with silence until I apologized for making him feel inadequate. From then on, I kept my empire in the shadows. I wore the clothes he bought me. I lived in the house he chose, and I endured Valerie's endless microaggressions about my lack of pedigree to keep the peace. But sitting in that hot car, listening to the echo of Valerie telling me to ask permission to spend a dime, I realized that shrinking myself had not protected my marriage. It had only given them permission to treat me like property. I started the engine. I was not going to go home and beg for my allowance. I was not going to cry over a declined transaction. I was going to dismantle their entire reality. I pulled out of the shopping plaza and merged onto the highway, heading straight for the financial district. My destination was not a retail store or a coffee shop. It was the premier private banking institution that managed my corporate assets. As I navigated through the heavy city traffic, my mind rapidly calculated my next move. This was not about petty revenge. This was about absolute financial leverage. Julian U.S. wealth management firm prided itself on catering to elite clients, but their internal structure was built on a house of cards. They relied heavily on a specific collateral pool provided by this very bank to maintain their institutional liquidity. What Julian did not know, what nobody in his arrogant little circle knew, was that the primary anchor of that collateral pool was a multi-million-dollar blind trust. My blind trust. My money was literally the safety net catching his firm's high-risk investments. I pulled up to the towering glass facade of the bank. The valet rushed forward to open my door, recognizing my face immediately. I bypassed the main teller lines and the standard customer service desks, walking straight toward the frosted glass double doors of the private wealth management sector. The branch manager, a seasoned financial veteran named Harrison, spotted me from his office and practically leapt out of his chair. "Maya," he greeted me, his tone a mixture of deep respect and slight surprise as he ushered me into his office and closed the door. "We usually handle these meetings at your corporate headquarters. What brings you down here today?" I took a seat in the leather chair across from his desk, placing my purse on the floor. "Harrison, I need to make an immediate structural change to my asset allocation. I want to legally detach my primary blind trust from the bank U.S. institutional collateral pool, effective immediately." Harrison froze. The professional smile slipped from his face, replaced by genuine alarm. "You understand the sheer volume of capital we are talking about, right? Pulling your trust out of the collateral pool without a 30-day notice will cause a massive liquidity shock. The wealth management firms leveraging that pool will face immediate margin calls. Their accounts will freeze within the hour." I looked him dead in the eye. "I am perfectly aware of the mechanics, Harrison. Execute the transfer." He swallowed hard, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. "If I do this right now, firms are going to panic. There is a specific group downtown that relies heavily on this exact pool. They could face catastrophic losses before the market closes." I leaned back in the chair, adjusting the cuff of my blazer. I gave him a calm, empty smile. "That sounds like a management issue for them, not a capital issue for me. Please prepare the authorization documents." Harrison did not argue further. He knew better than to question a client who controlled that much capital. He printed the heavily worded legal documents and slid them across the mahogany desk. I picked up the gold pen he offered and signed my name with steady, deliberate strokes. With every loop of ink, I felt 5 years of subservience, 5 years of biting my tongue, and 5 years of tolerating Valerie's insults wash away. "The transfer is processing," Harrison said, his voice remarkably quiet as he watched the confirmation screen. "The collateral pool is updating. The alerts are already going out to the leveraged firms." "Thank you, Harrison," I said, standing up and smoothing my clothes. "I will speak with you next week regarding the new acquisitions." I walked out of the glass office, down the marble hallway, and out through the heavy revolving doors of the bank. The Atlanta air was still thick and humid, but I breathed it in like it was the freshest breeze I had ever felt. I reached into my purse and finally pulled out my cell phone. The screen was completely illuminated, flooded with notifications. I had 44 missed calls from Julian, all logged within the last 15 minutes. Below his name were 3 frantic voicemails from the senior partner of his wealth management firm, the very man Julian spent every waking moment trying to impress. I did not call any of them back. I slid the phone into my pocket, signaled the valet for my car, and smiled. They wanted me to understand how real wealth worked. It was time to give them a masterclass. "I locked your credit card," my husband announced over the phone, his voice dripping with arrogant satisfaction. Then his mother chimed in from the background, warning me that I needed to ask their permission before I spent a single dime of his money. I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear. I simply hung up the phone, walked out of the store, and drove straight to my private bank. 1 hour later, my phone lit up with 44 missed calls from my husband and 3 frantic voicemails from his boss. They were about to learn exactly whose money was funding their perfect illusion. "My name is Jada, and I am 35 years old. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled my husband and his family in a single afternoon, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to shrink your own success to protect a fragile man and his ego." The scent of white tea and expensive silk hung heavy in the air of the exclusive bridal boutique in Buckhead, Atlanta. My best friend was getting married next month, and I had just found the perfect custom veil to complete her look. It was a modest purchase costing barely $400. I smiled at the young cashier as I handed over my debit card, which was tied to the joint account I shared with my husband Terrence. She ran the card through the terminal, and a sharp, flat beep broke the quiet elegance of the store. The cashier frowned and tried it a second time. Another beep sounded. She looked up at me with a mixture of pity and polite embarrassment, explaining that the card had been restricted. Before I could even reach into my purse for another card, my cell phone began to vibrate violently. The caller ID flashed with Terrence and his name. We had been married for 5 years, and I knew that specific rapid-fire calling meant he was monitoring our joint account. I answered the phone expecting him to ask about the transaction. Instead, his voice came through the speaker loud enough for the cashier to hear every single word. "Put the veil back, Jada," he ordered without any greeting. "I get notifications the second a transaction is attempted. I locked the card while you were standing at the register to teach you some financial discipline." I stood completely still, feeling the eyes of the boutique staff on my back. "Terrence," I said, keeping my voice meticulously calm, "I am buying a wedding gift for my best friend. Unlock the card right now." A sharp, condescending laugh echoed through the receiver, but it did not belong to my husband. It belonged to Vivian, his mother. She had been listening on speakerphone the entire time. "You are living in our world now, Jada." Vivian sneered, her tone layered with years of barely concealed disdain. "We raised Terrence to be a provider and a leader, but we did not raise him to fund a charity case from the wrong side of Atlanta." Vivian had never missed an opportunity to remind me of my roots. She viewed her family as Southern royalty and treated me like an unwelcome stray that her son had taken pity on. "You bring nothing to this marriage but a freelance consulting hobby that barely covers your own gas money," Vivian continued, her voice dripping with venom. "You need to respect the man who provides your luxurious lifestyle. Ask us before you spend a dime of my son and his hard-earned money." The cashier pretended to organize a stack of receipts, desperate to look anywhere but at my face. The humiliation was completely intentional. Terrence and Vivian thrived on this kind of psychological warfare. Terrence was a junior partner at a high-end wealth management firm. He made a respectable salary that he treated like a billionaire and his fortune. From the day we met, he loved playing the savior, the successful financial executive who scooped up a struggling girl and gave her a comfortable life. And for 5 years, I let him believe that fantasy. I swallowed my pride, I shrank my presence, and I played the role of the humble, supportive wife to protect his incredibly fragile ego. "You need to understand the value of $1. Terrence added, his voice swelling with unearned authority. "Go home, Jada. We will discuss your budget when I get off work." I looked down at the useless piece of plastic in my hand. It was a physical leash designed to keep me submissive. I had spent half a decade depositing a tiny, carefully calculated allowance into that joint account from my supposedly struggling business, just to make him feel like the undisputed head of the household. "Understood," I said softly into the phone. I ended the call without another word. I did not throw a tantrum, and I did not try to explain myself. I simply turned to the cashier, offered a genuine apology for the inconvenience, and walked out of the boutique into the sweltering Atlanta afternoon. The heat hit me the moment I stepped onto the pavement, but internally I had never felt colder. I walked to the practical, understated sedan. Terrence had picked out for me because he said it was sensible for a woman of my modest means. I sat in the driver's seat, locked the doors, and unzipped the hidden interior compartment of my handbag. I reached past my car keys and pulled out a solid metal black card. It was heavy, cool to the touch, and bore no spending limit whatsoever. Vivian and Terrence thought I was a freelancer surviving on their benevolence. They had no idea that the brand consulting business I started in my 20s had pivoted years ago. They had no idea that while Terrence was bragging about his junior partnership, I was quietly acquiring commercial real estate across the Southeast. They had no idea that I was the sole founder and majority shareholder of Apex Acquisitions, a massive commercial real estate firm that practically owned the skyline they looked at every day from their office windows. I had hidden my wealth because the one time I tried to celebrate a minor business victory early in our marriage, Terrence had sulked for an entire week. He punished me with icy silence until I apologized for making him feel inadequate. From then on, I kept my empire in the shadows. I wore the clothes he bought me, I lived in the house he chose, and I endured Vivian and her endless microaggressions about my lack of pedigree just to keep the peace in my marriage. But sitting in that hot car, listening to the echo of Vivian telling me to ask permission to spend a dime, I realized a devastating truth. Shrinking myself had not protected my marriage. It had only given them permission to treat me like property. My silence had not bought me peace, it had bought me disrespect. I started the engine. I was not going to go home and beg for my allowance. I was not going to cry over a declined transaction at a bridal shop. I was going to dismantle their entire reality. I pulled out of the shopping plaza and merged onto the highway, heading straight for the financial district. My destination was not a retail store or a coffee shop. It was the premier private banking institution that managed my corporate assets. As I navigated through the heavy city traffic, my mind rapidly calculated my next move. This was not about petty revenge. This was about absolute financial leverage. Terrence and his wealth management firm prided itself on catering to elite clients, but their internal structure was built on a house of cards. They relied heavily on a specific collateral pool provided by this very bank to maintain their institutional liquidity and fund their high-risk investments. What Terrence did not know, what nobody in his arrogant little family knew, was that the primary anchor of that collateral pool was a multi-million-dollar blind trust. My blind trust. My money was literally the safety net catching his firm and their reckless financial maneuvers. For years, my hidden capital had been silently subsidizing the very lifestyle he used to make me feel small. I gripped the steering wheel tightly. As the towering glass facade of the private bank came into view, the valet rushed forward to open my door, recognizing my face immediately. I stepped out of the sensible sedan, holding my head high. I bypassed the main teller lines and the standard customer service desks, walking straight toward the frosted glass double doors of the private wealth management sector. The branch manager, a seasoned financial veteran named Harrison, spotted me from his office and practically leapt out of his chair. He greeted me with a mixture of deep respect and slight surprise, ushering me into his office and closing the door. "We usually handle these meetings at your corporate headquarters," he noted, gesturing for me to sit. "What brings you down here today, Jada?" I took a seat in the leather chair across from his desk, placing my purse on the floor. "Harrison, I need to make an immediate structural change to my asset allocation," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "I want to legally detach my primary blind trust from the bank and its institutional collateral pool, effective immediately." Harrison froze. The professional smile slipped from his face, replaced by genuine alarm. "Jada, you understand the sheer volume of capital we are talking about, right? Pulling your trust out of the collateral pool without a 30-day notice will cause a massive liquidity shock. The wealth management firms leveraging that pool will face immediate margin calls. Their accounts will freeze within the hour." I looked him dead in the eye, feeling the last remnants of the submissive wife fade away completely. "I am perfectly aware of the mechanics, Harrison, execute the transfer. He swallowed hard, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. If I do this right now, firms are going to panic. There is a specific group downtown that relies heavily on this exact pool. They could face catastrophic losses before the market closes. I leaned back in the chair, adjusting the cuff of my blouse. I gave him a calm, empty smile. That sounds like a management issue for them, not a capital issue for me. Please prepare the authorization documents. It was time to stop playing small. I walked out of the heavy frosted glass doors of the private bank and stepped into the thick, humid air of the Atlanta afternoon. The sweltering heat wrapped around me instantly, but my mind was sharper and colder than it had been in 5 long years. I slid into the driver's seat of my sensible sedan, closed the door, and finally allowed myself to look at the screen of my cell phone. 44 missed calls from Julian. All of them had come through in the span of 1 single hour. Beneath his name were 3 frantic voicemails from the senior partner of his wealth management firm. I connected my phone to the car Bluetooth system and pressed play, leaning back into the driver's seat to listen to the beautiful sound of a crumbling ego. Julian and his first voicemail was exactly what I expected. His voice dripped with that familiar, arrogant annoyance he always used when he felt I was stepping out of line. "Maya, call me back right now," he snapped. "You are embarrassing me acting like a child because I put a limit on your spending. Put whatever cash you took out back into the joint account before I get home, and we will discuss your behavior later." I smiled and let the recording skip to his 5th voicemail left about 20 minutes later. The smug arrogance was starting to crack, revealing the foundation of panic beneath. "Maya, the bank is saying your profile is completely locked, and I do not have authorization to view the routing numbers. Stop playing games and call me back immediately." By the time I reached his final voicemail, left just 3 minutes ago, the facade of the powerful financial executive had completely shattered. "Maya, what did you do at the bank?" He was practically hyperventilating, his breath catching in the microphone. "Our margin accounts just froze. The entire trading floor is locked out of the collateral pool. My boss is screaming at me. Pick up the phone right now." I tapped the screen to play the voicemail from his senior partner. It was short, brutal, and deeply satisfying. "Julian, get your wife on the phone right now and fix this liquidity glitch, or you can pack up your desk by 5 o'clock today." I put the car in drive and pulled onto the highway, heading north toward Sandy Springs. Every Sunday afternoon, Valerie demanded that the entire family gather at her sprawling estate for a mandatory dinner. It was a weekly ritual designed specifically to worship Julian and his brother-in-law Trent, while treating me like the unfortunate charity case who should be eternally grateful just to sit at their table. As I navigated through the heavy weekend traffic, I thought about all the Sunday dinners I had endured sitting quietly while Tasha mocked my clothes and Trent made passive-aggressive jokes about my freelance income. Trent loved to talk about his consulting firm, acting like he was a titan of industry, when I secretly knew Valerie was funding his luxurious lifestyle. They had built an entire family culture around making me feel small, around reminding me that I was an outsider who should be grateful. They even let me through the front door. They needed me to be poor so they could feel rich. They needed me to be weak so they could feel powerful. I thought about the sheer irony of Julian and his sudden panic. For half a decade, he had bragged at every family dinner about his brilliant investment strategies, his keen eye for high-risk market leverage, and his undeniable financial genius. He loved to look down his nose at my brand consulting business, calling it a cute little freelance project that barely paid for my own groceries. He would lecture me on the principles of compound interest while pouring himself expensive scotch, completely unaware that he was talking to a woman who owned half the commercial retail space in the metropolitan area. He had absolutely no idea that his entire career, his firm and its massive success, and his untouchable ego were entirely subsidized by my capital. The institutional liquidity pool his firm used to execute their highly leveraged trades was anchored by my blind trust. I was the silent ghost in the machine, keeping his entire world afloat. And with one signature in a glass-walled office, I had just pulled the plug. I turned into the exclusive gated community where Valerie lived. Her estate was a massive brick colonial sitting on 2 acres of manicured lawn, deliberately designed to project old money elegance. I parked my modest sedan between Trent and his bright red sports car and Valerie and her luxury SUV. I grabbed my leather handbag, took a deep cleansing breath, and walked up the pristine brick steps to the front door. I did not bother knocking. I stepped into the grand foyer and immediately heard the chaotic hum of tension radiating from the dining room. I walked through the arched doorway and took in the scene. The long mahogany dining table was set with fine china and crystal glasses, but nobody was eating. Julian was pacing frantically back and forth across the Persian rug, sweating completely through his tailored designer shirt. He was staring at his phone, muttering curses under his breath. Tasha, my entitled sister-in-law, was sitting at the table scrolling through her social media with an expression of profound boredom. Valerie stood near the head of the table, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face pinched with extreme disapproval. And leaning against the custom marble buffet cart, swirling a glass of expensive red wine, was Trent. My white brother-in-law, who had always believed his marriage to Tasha granted him supreme authority over the family hierarchy. The moment my shoes clicked against the hardwood floor, all motion in the room stopped. Julian whipped his head around, his eyes wide and bloodshot. Before he could even open his mouth to speak, Trent took a slow, arrogant sip of his wine and smiled at me. Julian told us you threw a little tantrum at the boutique and then marched down to the bank to drain your little joint account. Trent said, his voice echoing with unbearable smugness. You really do not understand how real wealth works, do you, Maya? You cannot just throw a fit and mess with banking routing numbers because your husband put you on a budget. Leave the finances to the professionals before you get Julian in trouble. I stopped at the edge of the dining table, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I did not look at Trent. I did not even acknowledge his presence. I looked directly at Valerie, who was glaring at me like I was dirt on her shoe. I told you to ask before you spend a single dime of my son and his money, Valerie scolded, stepping forward to assert her matriarchal dominance. You have embarrassed Julian at his firm today, Maya. You have acted like an ungrateful child. I warned him about marrying someone from your background. You have no concept of financial responsibility, and now you are causing a scene over a wedding gift. Julian finally closed the distance between us. He looked terrified, but he was trying desperately to maintain his tough guy persona in front of his mother and his brother-in-law. He reached out and grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging painfully into my skin. You are going to call the bank right now, Julian demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of explosive rage and raw panic. You are going to call the branch manager, and you are going to tell him to fix whatever glitch you caused in my firm and its accounts. Do you hear me, Maya? You are going to fix this before I lose my job. I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. Then I looked up into his panicked, sweating face. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of fear or submission. Let go of me, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. Julian hesitated, but something in my cold, dead stare made him slowly release his grip. He stepped back, swallowing hard. The entire room fell into a stunned, breathless silence. They had never seen me defy him before. I reached into my leather handbag. I did not pull out my cell phone to call the bank. I did not pull out the joint debit card. I pulled out a thick, heavy legal document stamped and notarized by the county clerk. I raised the document and let it drop directly onto Valerie and her pristine mahogany dining table. It hit the polished wood with a heavy, undeniable thud that made Tasha jump in her seat. I looked directly at my mother-in-law, holding her shocked gaze with absolute chilling authority. You told me to ask before I spend a dime. I said, my words slicing through the silent room like glass. So I am asking, how does it feel knowing I just bought the debt on this house? The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. For a long, suspended moment, nobody breathed. The only sound in the sprawling dining room was the low hum of the central air conditioning and the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Then Valerie burst into laughter. It was a sharp, brittle sound, completely devoid of actual humor. She looked around the room, shaking her head, as if I had just delivered the punchline to an incredibly tasteless joke. Tasha let out a loud, dramatic sigh and rolled her eyes, going back to her phone. Trent chuckled into his wineglass. Only Julian remained completely, entirely silent. You are losing your mind, Maya, Valerie sneered, stepping away from the table as if the legal document I had dropped was contaminated. This estate was paid off in full 15 years ago. My late husband and I built this property from the ground up. There is not a single cent of debt on this land. You really are just a desperate, pathetic girl throwing a tantrum because my son finally cut off your allowance. Pick up your fake little papers and get out of my house before I call security." I did not move. I did not blink. I kept my eyes locked on Valerie, then slowly shifted my gaze to Julian. I was trembling. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. Sweat was pooling at his temples and his breathing was shallow and erratic. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows waiting for the lever to be pulled. "Tell her, Julian," I said, my voice soft but commanding. "Tell your mother about the tax optimization strategy you had her sign last November. Tell her about the massive stack of routine wealth management documents you brought to this very dining table and told her to initial without reading." Valerie stopped laughing. She looked at me and then turned her sharp gaze toward her golden boy. "Julian, what is she talking about?" Valerie demanded. Julian opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He swallowed hard, taking a stumbling step backward until his back hit the custom marble buffet cart. "Since your son has suddenly lost his ability to speak, I will translate for him," I said, picking up the heavy document and holding it out. I did not force it into her hands. I simply let it hover in the space between us, forcing her to acknowledge it. Julian is a junior partner at his firm, which means his compensation is heavily tied to the performance of his individual portfolio. But Julian is not the financial genius you all pretend he is. 2 years ago, he took a massive position in a high-risk offshore tech venture. He leveraged his own assets and he lost everything. He was facing a margin call that would have wiped him out and exposed him as a fraud to his senior partners. So he needed capital. Fast. I took a slow, deliberate step toward Valerie, who was now staring at her son with wide, terrified eyes. "He could not use my money because my assets were legally walled off from him." I continued, savoring the absolute destruction of his pride. "So he used yours. Under the guise of restructuring your estate for tax purposes, Julian embedded an authorization for a revolving credit line secured by the equity of this house. He took out a $3.2 million second mortgage on your pristine paid-off estate, Valerie. And he dumped every single penny of it into the market, trying to chase his losses." "That is a lie!" Valerie screamed, her voice cracking with sudden raw panic. "Julian, tell me she is lying right now. Tell me you did not mortgage my home." Julian squeezed his eyes shut and buried his face in his hands. "Mom, I was going to pay it back," he whimpered, his voice cracking like a terrified child. "I just needed a little more time." The market shifted unexpectedly. "I had a plan to cover the balloon payments before you ever found out." The sound that came out of Valerie was something between a gasp and a sob. She stumbled, clutching the back of a dining chair to keep her balance. The great untouchable matriarch, the woman who had spent 5 years treating me like an uneducated peasant, was suddenly realizing that the son she worshipped had secretly gambled away the roof over her head. Tasha dropped her phone on the floor, the screen shattering against the hardwood. "What do you mean you mortgaged the house?" Tasha shrieked, lunging toward her brother. "That estate is my inheritance, Julian. You stole my inheritance to cover your bad trades." The room exploded into chaos. Tasha was screaming at Julian, beating her fists against his chest while he tried weakly to push her away. Valerie was hyperventilating, clinging to the chair and demanding to know how this was possible. They were tearing each other apart, tearing down the perfect facade they had maintained for decades. I stood perfectly still in the center of the madness, untouched by their panic. "You still do not understand the best part, Valerie," I said, raising my voice just enough to cut through the screaming. The entire room froze, turning back to me. "Julian missed 3 consecutive balloon payments on that secret mortgage," I explained, walking slowly around the perimeter of the dining table, running my fingertips along the polished wood. The private bank was preparing to quietly seize the asset. They were going to foreclose on this estate by the end of the month. But banks do not like the messy optics of evicting high-profile community members. They prefer to sell distressed debt to private equity firms to handle the dirty work. I stopped right in front of Valerie, dropping the document directly at her feet. "My holding company, Apex Acquisitions, specializes in distressed high-net-worth commercial and residential debt," I said, watching the horrific realization wash over her face. When the bank flagged the collateral tied to a defaulting junior partner, my acquisitions team immediately purchased the note. We bought your $3.2 million debt for pennies on the dollar. Valerie looked down at the stamped legal document on the floor. I am not a struggling freelancer. Valerie, I whispered, leaning in close so she could hear every syllable of her own ruin. I am the sole owner of Apex Acquisitions. I am the silent capital that has been keeping Julian and his firm afloat. And as of an hour ago, I am the sole owner of the mortgage on this estate. I own the ground you are standing on. I own the walls surrounding you. And because the loan is in default, I have the legal right to accelerate the collection. You have 30 days to pack your designer bags and vacate my property. Valerie let out a shattered, breathless wheeze. She looked like she was going to collapse. Julian was weeping openly against the buffet cart, his expensive designer suit stained with sweat and tears. Tasha was staring at me with a mixture of absolute terror and disbelief. Then the heavy clinking of ice against crystal broke the silence. Trent, my white brother-in-law, pushed himself off the wall and walked slowly to the center of the room. He set his wine glass down on the table with a loud, deliberate thud. He looked at Valerie, then at Julian, and finally he turned his smug, condescending gaze on me. He let out a low, patronizing chuckle, shaking his head as if he was dealing with a misbehaving toddler. This is a very cute performance, Maya Trent said, his voice dripping with that arrogant, unearned authority he always wielded in this house. You really had them going for a second there. I will admit the fake legal documents are a nice touch. Did you mock those up on your laptop between your little freelance gigs? I turned my body to face him fully, keeping my expression completely neutral. Trent stepped closer, trying to use his height and his physical presence to intimidate me. He crossed his arms over his chest, staring down at me with a smirk that made my blood boil. Listen to me very carefully, you delusional freelancer. Trent sneered, lowering his voice to a threatening whisper. You do not have the capital to buy a used Honda, let alone institutional debt. I know exactly what you make. Julian showed me your tax returns last year. You scrape by on 30 grand a year playing brand consultant on the internet. You are a broke girl from South Atlanta who got lucky enough to marry into a family that actually understands money. Trent reached down, picked up the foreclosure notice from the floor, and crumpled it into a ball right in front of my face. You did not buy anything, he continued, throwing the crumpled paper at my chest. You are throwing a desperate, pathetic tantrum because your husband finally cut off your credit card. So you are going to pick up your little fake documents, you are going to apologize to Valerie, and you are going to march back out to your cheap little car and drive away before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing and fraud. Do you understand me, Maya? I did not flinch when the paper hit my chest. I did not step back when he leaned into my space. I simply looked up at his smug, flushed face and let a slow, genuine smile spread across my lips. I was hoping you would speak up, Trent. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. For a long, suspended moment, nobody breathed. The only sound in the sprawling dining room was the low hum of the central air conditioning and the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Then Valerie burst into laughter. It was a sharp, brittle sound, completely devoid of actual humor. She looked around the room, shaking her head, as if I had just delivered the punchline to an incredibly tasteless joke. Tasha let out a loud, dramatic sigh and rolled her eyes, going back to her phone. Trent chuckled into his wine glass. Only Julian remained completely, entirely silent. You are losing your mind, Maya, Valerie sneered, stepping away from the table as if the legal document I had dropped was contaminated. This estate was paid off in full 15 years ago. My late husband and I built this property from the ground up. There is not a single cent of debt on this land. You really are just a desperate, pathetic girl throwing a tantrum because my son finally cut off your allowance. Pick up your fake little papers and get out of my house before I call security. I did not move. I did not blink. I kept my eyes locked on Valerie, then slowly shifted my gaze to Julian. I was trembling. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. Sweat was pooling at his temples, and his breathing was shallow and erratic. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows waiting for the lever to be pulled. Tell her, Julian, I said, my voice soft but commanding. Tell your mother about the tax optimization strategy you had her sign last November. Tell her about the massive stack of routine wealth management documents you brought to this very dining table and told her to initial without reading. Valerie stopped laughing. She looked at me, and then turned her sharp gaze toward her golden boy. Julian, what is she talking about? Valerie demanded. Julian opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He swallowed hard, taking a stumbling step backward until his back hit the custom marble buffet cart. Since your son has suddenly lost his ability to speak, I will translate for him, I said, picking up the heavy document and holding it out. I did not force it into her hands. I simply let it hover in the space between us, forcing her to acknowledge it. Julian is a junior partner at his firm, which means his compensation is heavily tied to the performance of his individual portfolio. But Julian is not the financial genius you all pretend he is. 2 years ago, he took a massive position in a high-risk offshore tech venture. He leveraged his own assets and he lost everything. He was facing a margin call that would have wiped him out and exposed him as a fraud to his senior partners. So he needed capital. Fast. I took a slow, deliberate step toward Valerie, who was now staring at her son with wide, terrified eyes. He could not use my money because my assets were legally walled off from him. I continued savoring the absolute destruction of his pride. So he used yours. Under the guise of restructuring your estate for tax purposes, Julian embedded an authorization for a revolving credit line secured by the equity of this house. He took out a $3.2 million second mortgage on your pristine, paid-off estate, Valerie. And he dumped every single penny of it into the market trying to chase his losses. That is a lie! Valerie screamed, her voice cracking with sudden raw panic. Julian, tell me she is lying right now. Tell me you did not mortgage my home. Julian squeezed his eyes shut and buried his face in his hands. Mom, I was going to pay it back. He whimpered, his voice cracking like a terrified child. I just needed a little more time. The market shifted unexpectedly. I had a plan to cover the balloon payments before you ever found out. The sound that came out of Valerie was something between a gasp and a sob. She stumbled, clutching the back of a dining chair to keep her balance. The great untouchable matriarch, the woman who had spent 5 years treating me like an uneducated peasant, was suddenly realizing that the son she worshipped had secretly gambled away the roof over her head. Tasha dropped her phone on the floor, the screen shattering against the hardwood. What do you mean you mortgaged the house? Tasha shrieked, lunging toward her brother. That estate is my inheritance, Julian. You stole my inheritance to cover your bad trades. The room exploded into chaos. Tasha was screaming at Julian, beating her fists against his chest while he tried weakly to push her away. Valerie was hyperventilating, clinging to the chair and demanding to know how this was possible. They were tearing each other apart, tearing down the perfect facade they had maintained for decades. I stood perfectly still in the center of the madness, untouched by their panic. You still do not understand the best part. Valerie, I said, raising my voice just enough to cut through the screaming. The entire room froze, turning back to me. Julian missed 3 consecutive balloon payments on that secret mortgage, I explained, walking slowly around the perimeter of the dining table, running my fingertips along the polished wood. The private bank was preparing to quietly seize the asset. They were going to foreclose on this estate by the end of the month. But banks do not like the messy optics of evicting high-profile community members. They prefer to sell distressed debt to private equity firms to handle the dirty work. I stopped right in front of Valerie, dropping the document directly at her feet. My holding company, Apex Acquisitions, specializes in distressed high-net-worth commercial and residential debt, I said, watching the horrific realization wash over her face. When the bank flagged the collateral tied to a defaulting junior partner, my acquisitions team immediately purchased the note. We bought your $3.2 million debt for pennies on the dollar. Valerie looked down at the stamped legal document on the floor. I am not a struggling freelancer, Valerie, I whispered, leaning in close so she could hear every syllable of her own ruin. I am the sole owner of Apex Acquisitions. I am the silent capital that has been keeping Julian and his firm afloat. And as of an hour ago, I am the sole owner of the mortgage on this estate. I own the ground you are standing on. I own the walls surrounding you. And because the loan is in default, I have the legal right to accelerate the collection. You have 30 days to pack your designer bags and vacate my property. Valerie let out a shattered, breathless wheeze. She looked like she was going to collapse. Julian was weeping openly against the buffet cart, his expensive designer suit stained with sweat and tears. Tasha was staring at me with a mixture of absolute terror and disbelief. Then the heavy clinking of ice against crystal broke the silence. Trent, my white brother-in-law, pushed himself off the wall and walked slowly to the center of the room. He set his wine glass down on the table with a loud, deliberate thud. He looked at Valerie, then at Julian, and finally he turned his smug, condescending gaze on me. He let out a low, patronizing chuckle, shaking his head as if he was dealing with a misbehaving toddler. "This is a very cute performance," Maya Trent said, his voice dripping with that arrogant, unearned authority he always wielded in this house. "You really had them going for a second there. I will admit the fake legal documents are a nice touch. Did you mock those up on your laptop between your little freelance gigs?" I turned my body to face him fully, keeping my expression completely neutral. Trent stepped closer, trying to use his height and his physical presence to intimidate me. He crossed his arms over his chest, staring down at me with a smirk that made my blood boil. "Listen to me very carefully, you delusional freelancer," Trent sneered, lowering his voice to a threatening whisper. "You do not have the capital to buy a used Honda, let alone institutional debt. I know exactly what you make. Julian showed me your tax returns last year. You scrape by on 30 grand a year playing brand consultant on the internet. You are a broke girl from South Atlanta who got lucky enough to marry into a family that actually understands money." Trent reached down, picked up the foreclosure notice from the floor, and crumpled it into a ball right in front of my face. "You did not buy anything," he continued, throwing the crumpled paper at my chest. "You are throwing a desperate, pathetic tantrum because your husband finally cut off your credit card. So you are going to pick up your little fake documents, you are going to apologize to Valerie, and you are going to march back out to your cheap little car and drive away before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing and fraud. Do you understand me, Maya?" I did not flinch when the paper hit my chest. I did not step back when he leaned into my space. I simply looked up at his smug, flushed face and let a slow, genuine smile spread across my lips. "I was hoping you would speak up, Trent," I said, my voice perfectly level. "You have always been so eager to insert yourself into family business. You love playing the role of the self-made business tycoon, dispensing your unsolicited advice while drinking Valerie and her expensive wine. Let us talk about your business, Trent." I walked past him, leaving the crumpled foreclosure notice on the floor. I moved directly to the massive smart television that dominated the far wall of Valerie and her living room. I pulled my tablet from my leather bag and tapped the screen, mirroring my display to the 80-inch television. The screen flickered to life, casting a bright white glow over the faces of the people who had tormented me for 5 years. "What are you doing?" Valerie demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and terror. "Turn that off in my house." I ignored her. I opened a digital folder and brought up the state corporate registry for Apex Acquisitions. The official government document filled the enormous screen. I highlighted the ownership section with a tap of my finger. "Read it, Trent," I commanded. "Read the name of the sole proprietor." Trent stared at the screen. The smug color drained from his face, rapidly replaced by the pale, sickly hue of a man realizing he had just stepped on a landmine. His eyes darted from the screen to me and back again. Tasha walked closer to the television, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood. "It says," Maya Tasha whispered, her voice laced with confusion. "It says she owns 100% of the shares." "That is right, Tasha," I said, turning to my sister-in-law. "I am the delusional freelancer who just bought the ground you are standing on. But my portfolio is not what we are here to discuss." I tapped my screen again. The corporate registry disappeared, replaced by a complex spreadsheet showing years of banking wire transfers. "Let us talk about Trent and his elite consulting firm." Trent took a sudden step forward, reaching his hand out as if he could physically grab the television screen and pull the numbers down. "Stop it!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "This is private financial information. You hacked my accounts. I will have you arrested." "You left your laptop open on my kitchen counter during the family barbecue last month, Trent," I explained calmly. "I did not have to hack anything. You were bragging about your latest corporate client, and I just happened to glance at your screen. What I saw was so fascinating that I had my own acquisitions team run a quiet background check on your firm." I zoomed in on the spreadsheet, magnifying the numbers so even Valerie could read them from her spot clinging to the dining room chair. Your husband loves to tell everyone how hard he works, Tasha, I said, directing my attention to her. He loves to belittle my career. But according to these bank records, his consulting firm has not had a single legitimate client in exactly 3 years. He has zero corporate revenue. Not a single cent of outside income has entered his business account since 2023. Tasha looked at Trent, her face contorting with disbelief. Trent, what is she talking about? Tasha asked, her voice pitching upward. We just bought the new Porsche. We just booked that trip to Dubai. If you do not have clients, where is the money coming from? Trent was sweating now, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. Tasha, do not listen to her, he stammered, taking a step toward his wife. She is manipulating the documents. She is just trying to deflect from what she did to your mother. I tapped the screen one more time. The final set of documents appeared. They were not just spreadsheets. They were copies of cleared checks and digital wire authorizations. The money came from your mother, Tasha, I said, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. But it did not come from her personal accounts. Valerie let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Your husband has been embezzling funds from the Valerie Heritage Foundation, I announced, exposing the final layer of their rotting family facade. He set up his consulting firm as a phantom vendor for your mother and her charitable organization. Every month for 3 years, he has been billing the charity for fake consulting services. He is taking donation money meant for underprivileged youth programs and routing it directly into his personal accounts. No, Valerie shrieked, stumbling forward. No, that is impossible. Trent manages the foundation accounts. He is the financial director. He would never steal from the charity. Look at the screen. Valerie, I commanded, refusing to let her look away from the truth. Look at the routing numbers. Those are $50,000 wires moving from the foundation directly to the dealership where he bought his sports car. Look at the $30,000 transfer he made last week to cover Tasha and her luxury shopping spree at Phipps Plaza. Your entire lifestyle, Tasha, your designer bags, your vacations, your husband and his cars, they are all funded by stolen charity money. Tasha turned slowly to look at Trent. The denial in her eyes vanished entirely, replaced by a feral, explosive rage. She realized in that moment that the man she thought was providing her with endless luxury was actually a criminal who had just destroyed her reputation and her future. You stole from my mother! Tasha screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. She lunged at Trent, slapping him hard across the face. The sharp crack of her hand against his cheek sounded like a gunshot. Trent stumbled backward, raising his arms to shield his face. Tasha, stop it, he pleaded, backing away toward the front door. I had to do it. You would not stop spending money. You were draining my savings and your mother refused to increase our allowance. I did it for you. Do not blame me for your crimes, Tasha shrieked, grabbing a decorative vase from the hallway table and hurling it at him. The vase smashed against the wall, sending porcelain shards flying across the foyer. You are a fraud. You are nothing but a thief. Valerie fell to her knees, weeping uncontrollably into her hands. The great matriarch was completely broken. In less than 20 minutes, she had discovered that her golden boy Julian had secretly mortgaged her estate to the point of foreclosure, and her trusted son-in-law. Trent had been embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from her namesake charity. The perfect elite family she had sacrificed everything to project to the world was a complete lie. It was a house of cards built on debt theft and absolute delusion. I stood watching them tear each other apart. 5 years of holding my tongue, 5 years of taking their insults, 5 years of shrinking my own light to keep them comfortable. This was the harvest they had planted. They were drowning in the very toxicity they had created. Trent was scrambling for the front door, trying to escape Tasha and her flying fists. Julian was still slumped against the buffet cart, paralyzed by his own ruin, staring blankly at the floor. Valerie was rocking back and forth on the carpet, mourning the death of her social standing. I walked over to the smart television and disconnected my tablet, the screen going black. I slid the device back into my leather bag and closed the zipper. I had delivered exactly what they deserved, the truth. I turned to walk toward the front door, stepping carefully over the shattered pieces of porcelain on the floor. I did not say goodbye. I did not offer any final words of advice. They had nothing left that I wanted. But just as I reached the archway of the foyer, a sharp electronic trill cut through the sounds of Valerie sobbing and Tasha screaming. It was Julian and his cell phone. The ringing was loud and insistent, demanding attention. Julian slowly reached into the pocket of his ruined designer suit and pulled out the phone. His hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped it. He stared at the caller ID, and all the remaining blood drained from his face. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with absolute sheer terror. "It is my boss," Julian whispered, his voice barely audible over the ringing. "It is the senior partner. He is calling me back." "Answer it, Julian," I said, stopping in the doorway. I turned to face him, folding my hands in front of me. "Put it on speaker. Let the whole family hear how real wealth works." The ringing of Julian and his cell phone felt incredibly loud in the shattered silence of Valerie and her dining room. It was a sharp, demanding sound that cut right through the heavy air of the estate. Julian stood frozen by the marble buffet cart, staring down at the device in his shaking hand, as if it were a live grenade. The caller ID flashed brightly in the dimming afternoon light, displaying the name of the senior partner at his wealth management firm. "Answer it, Julian," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely steady. I did not move from my spot near the archway. I simply stood with my hands folded, watching the man who had tormented me for 5 years completely fall apart. "Put it on speaker. Let the whole family hear how real wealth works." Julian swallowed so hard I could see his throat bob. His arrogant swagger, the puffed-out chest, and the condescending smirk he had worn just an hour ago were entirely gone. He looked small. He looked terrified. With trembling fingers, he swiped the screen and tapped the speaker button. "Julian, you arrogant fool, are you listening to me?" The voice of Richard, the senior partner, boomed out of the small phone speaker. The sheer volume and unbridled fury in his tone made Valerie flinch from her spot on the carpet. "I am here," Richard, Julian stammered, his voice pitching up an octave. "Please tell me the bank fixed the routing glitch. Tell me the margin accounts are stabilizing." There was a harsh, bitter laugh on the other end of the line. "Stabilizing," Richard roared. "We were 10 minutes away from complete institutional insolvency, Julian. Do you have any idea what you have done? Your reckless offshore positions and the sudden evaporation of our primary collateral pool almost wiped out 30 years of this firm and its legacy. We were hemorrhaging capital. We had to execute an emergency buyout just to keep the doors open." Julian gripped the edge of the buffet cart to keep his knees from buckling. "An emergency buyout," he repeated, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. "What does that mean, Richard? What happened to the firm?" "A private equity group stepped in 20 minutes ago," Richard explained, his voice dripping with absolute venom. "They offered us an immediate liquidity bridge to cover the margin calls, but they demanded 51% of our voting shares in exchange. We had no choice, Julian. We had to sell majority control to save the firm from going under. And the very first directive from the new board of directors was your immediate termination." Julian stopped breathing. The phone slipped slightly in his sweaty palm. What he gasped. "You cannot do that, Richard. I am a junior partner. I brought in millions for this firm. I am part of the leadership team." "You are a liability," Richard snapped back, cutting him off completely. "You are fired, Julian. Security is packing your desk into a cardboard box right now. Your corporate accounts are frozen, and your building access badges have been deactivated. If you ever set foot on our trading floor again, I will have you arrested for trespassing. And if I find out that your personal financial mess is what triggered the bank to pull our collateral today, I will personally sue you into the Stone Age. Do not ever contact me again." The line went dead with a sharp click. The dial tone echoed through the dining room for a fleeting second before the screen faded to black. Julian slowly lowered the phone. His eyes were wide and vacant, staring at the dark screen as if he could not comprehend the words he had just heard. His job was his entire identity. Being a junior partner at that firm was the weapon he used to force the world to respect him. It was the shield he hid behind to mask his deep insecurities. He used his salary to control me, to belittle my business, and to make himself feel like a king. Now he was nothing. I was unemployed, disgraced, and blacklisted from the only industry he knew. He slowly raised his head. His bloodshot eyes locked onto mine. He looked at my calm expression, my steady posture, and the complete lack of surprise on my face. I watched the gears in his mind desperately trying to turn, trying to make sense of the catastrophic collapse of his entire universe. The bank pulled the collateral, he whispered, his voice trembling. The private equity group swooped in and bought the firm. They demanded my termination. He took a shaky step toward me, dropping his phone onto the floor. It landed near the crumpled foreclosure notice Trent had thrown at me earlier. Apex Acquisitions. Julian said, his voice breaking on the name of my holding company. You said your company buys distressed high-net-worth assets. I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. Yes, Julian, I do. You bought my firm, he gasped, clutching his chest, as if he could not draw enough oxygen into his lungs. You bought my firm and you fired me. I took one step back into the dining room, bringing myself closer to the wreckage of his ego. I did not raise my voice. I wanted him to lean in to hear every single word of his defeat. When I detached my blind trust from the bank and its collateral pool, I knew your firm would panic. I explained, my tone as clinical as a surgeon. Financial firms built on leverage cannot survive a sudden liquidity drain. I knew Richard would be desperate for a bailout before the market closed. So my acquisitions team was waiting. They offered Richard a lifeline. We injected enough capital to save the firm from bankruptcy, but in exchange, Apex Acquisitions now owns 51% of the company. Julian let out a ragged, desperate sob. He fell to his knees, his expensive suit pants hitting the hardwood floor right next to the shattered pieces of the porcelain vase Tasha had thrown at Trent. I am your boss now, Julian. I continued, looking down at him. I am the majority shareholder. I own the desk you sat at. I own the building you worked in. And my very first executive decision was to cut the dead weight from my payroll. Tasha let out a loud, hysterical wail, covering her face with her hands. She had just watched her husband exposed as a thief, and her brother destroyed as a fraud. The endless fountain of money she thought she was entitled to had completely dried up. Trent, taking advantage of the distraction, quietly slipped out the front door, leaving his wife behind to face the consequences of their actions. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, sealing his cowardly exit. Valerie pushed herself up from the floor, clutching the edge of the dining table with trembling fingers. Her perfect hair was disheveled, and her makeup was smeared down her cheeks. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic kind of bargaining. Maya, Valerie pleaded, her voice shaking. Maya, please, we can fix this. You are part of this family. We can sit down and work this out. I can talk to Julian. He will apologize. We will treat you better. You do not have to do this to us. I stared at the woman who had spent 5 years treating me like dirt. She did not love me. She did not respect me. She only respected the power I now held over her. The moment she realized I controlled the money, I suddenly became family. It was the most transactional, disgusting display of affection I had ever witnessed. I turned my attention back to Julian, who was still kneeling on the floor, weeping into his hands. I thought about the moment in the bridal boutique when he told me he locked my card to teach me discipline. I thought about the sheer arrogance in his voice when he commanded me to go home and wait for my punishment. I did not just lock your credit card, Julian, I said, my voice echoing with finality. I locked your entire life. I turned to Valerie, who was shaking uncontrollably, clinging to her dining chair. Pack your bags, Valerie, I commanded, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. Pack up your designer clothes and your expensive china. You all have 30 days to vacate my property before the sheriff arrives to forcibly remove you. I turned on my heel, the sound of my shoes striking the hardwood floor like a gavel slamming down on a judge and its desk. I walked through the arched doorway, down the grand hallway, and out the front door of the estate. The heavy heat of the Atlanta afternoon washed over me as I walked down the brick steps toward my car. Behind me, I could hear the muffled sounds of Julian sobbing and Valerie screaming his name. It was the sound of a toxic dynasty collapsing into dust. I unlocked my car, got into the driver's seat, and started the engine, driving away from the wreckage and straight into my new reality. The weekend passed like a cleansing storm, washing away 5 years of carefully constructed lies. By Monday morning, the adrenaline of the confrontation had settled into a cold corporate focus. I arrived at the Apex Acquisitions headquarters in downtown Atlanta, stepping out of a chauffeured black car and walking into the towering glass and steel building that I owned. For years, I had played the role of the struggling consultant working from the kitchen island. Today I took the private elevator straight to the executive floor, stepping into my actual reality. I had barely finished my first cup of coffee when the phone on my desk buzzed. It was my head of security. He informed me that my husband was currently in the lobby screaming at the front desk staff and demanding to see the chief executive officer. Julian had not come alone. He had brought an attorney with him and was threatening to call the police if he was not granted immediate access to the building. I did not panic. I simply instructed security to escort them up to the main executive boardroom and offer them water. I wanted Julian to see exactly what he was up against. I walked down the quiet carpeted hallway and entered the boardroom. It was a massive space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. A long custom marble table dominated the room. I took my seat at the head of the table. Flanking me were three of my elite corporate attorneys, including my lead counsel, a brilliant and entirely ruthless woman named Carter, who had structured every major acquisition I had ever made. 10 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. Julian stormed into the room, projecting a desperate kind of aggressive energy. The pristine image of the high-powered financial executive was gone. He looked exhausted. His suit was wrinkled and his eyes were dark with fury and lack of sleep. Beside him walked a man holding a scuffed leather briefcase, wearing a cheap suit that smelled faintly of stale cologne. This was clearly a strip mall divorce attorney Julian had scrambled to hire over the weekend. Julian stopped halfway down the length of the marble table. He looked around the immaculate boardroom, taking in the expensive art, the sweeping city views, and the silent, intimidating presence of my legal team. I could see the bitter jealousy flashing in his eyes. He hated that this space belonged to me. "You think you can just ambush my family and walk away?" Maya, Julian sneered, slamming both hands down on the table to lean toward me. "You think you can fire me from my own firm, steal my mother and her house, and leave us with nothing? You are completely delusional." I sat perfectly still, resting my hands on the cool marble. I did not offer him a greeting. I just let his angry words echo and die in the massive room. Julian gestured to the sweaty man standing next to him. "This is my attorney, and we are here to officially inform you that you have made the biggest mistake of your life." The sleazy attorney puffed out his chest and opened his briefcase, pulling out a thick stack of legal documents. He cleared his throat, trying to sound authoritative in a room that vastly outclassed him. "My client is prepared to file a massive lawsuit for wrongful termination and corporate sabotage," the attorney announced, tossing the papers onto the table. "But more importantly, we are initiating immediate divorce proceedings. Under state law, any assets, businesses, or wealth accumulated during the tenure of the marriage are subject to equitable distribution. You built this company while married to my client. Therefore, he is legally entitled to 50% of everything you own." Julian crossed his arms over his chest, a triumphant, ugly smirk spreading across his face. He actually thought he had me cornered. He thought the law was going to swoop in and hand him half of my empire as a reward for his 5 years of financial and emotional abuse. "You wanted to play corporate titan," Julian said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Well, welcome to the big leagues, Maya. You are going to give me half of Apex Acquisitions. You are going to give me half 8-figure settlement for the career damages you caused on Friday. If you refuse, we will drag your name through every family court and business publication in Georgia until your reputation is completely destroyed." He reached out and slapped the draft divorce settlement hard against the table, pushing it toward me. It was his ultimate intimidation tactic. He was trying to bully me into surrendering my wealth, just like he had bullied me into shrinking my personality. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not even look at the ridiculous stack of papers he had just pushed in my direction. I turned my head slightly and looked at Carter, my lead attorney. I gave her a single subtle nod. Carter did not argue with Julian. She did not debate marital law with his cheap lawyer. She simply reached into her sleek designer briefcase and pulled out a single yellowed folder. Her expression was completely bored as she placed the folder on the smooth marble surface and calmly slid it across the long table right until it hit Julian and his knuckles. The heavy yellowed cardstock of the folder made a soft scraping sound as Carter slid it across the long expanse of the custom marble table. It moved with deliberate precision, stopping right at the edge of the draft divorce settlement, Julian had just slammed down. Julian stared at the folder for a second, his chest heaving with arrogant breaths. He looked at me expecting to see fear or panic. He expected me to be intimidated by his aggressive posturing and his loud demands for half of my empire. But I simply sat back in my leather executive chair completely unbothered. Julian let out a harsh, dismissive scoff. He reached out and snatched the folder off the marble surface. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the massive boardroom. "More fake documents, Maya. Are you really trying to play legal games with me?" I did not answer him. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the weight of the room to press down on him. Julian shoved the folder toward his sleazy attorney. "Read it," Julian commanded, waving his hand dismissively. "Tell her how fast we are going to tear apart whatever amateur contract she printed off the internet. We are leaving here with half of this company and I am not negotiating." The attorney picked up the folder. He adjusted the collar of his cheap suit jacket, clearing his throat as he opened the cover. I watched his eyes scan the first page. I watched the arrogant smirk on his face slowly begin to falter. The document inside that folder was not a recent creation. It was exactly 3 years old, and it was the greatest financial trap Julian had ever built for himself. 3 years ago, we were living in a midtown apartment while Julian was trying desperately to climb the ladder at his wealth management firm. He wanted to be a senior partner so badly that it consumed his every waking thought. He needed to prove he was a financial genius capable of generating massive returns. So behind my back, he took hundreds of thousands of dollars of his own savings and dumped it into a highly volatile, unregulated cryptocurrency venture. I thought he was going to double his net worth in a month. Instead, the market crashed, and he lost everything in 48 hours. I remember the night he realized the money was gone. He paced the floor of our apartment at 2 in the morning, sweating and trembling, terrified that his senior partners would discover how recklessly he had gambled his assets. But Julian could never admit fault. He could never show weakness. So he masked his absolute terror with explosive anger, and he directed all of that anger at me. He printed out a generic legal form he had found online and slammed it onto our kitchen counter. He told me it was a tax liability waiver. He spent an hour screaming at me about how my freelance brand consulting business was disorganized and unprofitable. He claimed my supposed tax liabilities were going to trigger an audit that would ruin his pristine financial standing at his firm. He told me I was a liability to his career, and he demanded that I sign the waiver to protect him from my failures. I took the paper from the counter. I did not argue with him. I did not defend my business. But I also did not sign it right away. I took that flimsy generic document straight to Carter, who was already my lead corporate counsel at Apex Acquisitions. I sat in her office and we spent 3 entire days tearing that document apart and rewriting every single clause. We transformed his amateur tax waiver into an airtight total separation post-nuptial agreement. We drafted it using the most impenetrable legal language possible. It explicitly stated that any corporate entities, trusts, holding companies, or physical assets developed, acquired, or maintained by either party would remain their sole and separate property in the event of a divorce. It waived all rights to equitable distribution. It waived all rights to alimony. It created an absolute insurmountable financial wall between us. I brought the revised document back to our apartment and placed it on Julian and his desk. Julian was so incredibly arrogant, so utterly blinded by his desperation to protect his remaining pennies from my supposed debts that he did not even bother to read the revised clauses. He assumed I was just the obedient, submissive wife doing exactly what I was told. He signed the final draft right there in our kitchen, completely unaware that he was legally locking himself out of a billion-dollar real estate empire. Now, 3 years later, I sat in my boardroom and watched his cheap divorce attorney read that exact same document. The attorney swallowed hard, his atom and his apple bobbing nervously. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sick and pale. He flipped to the second page, reading the clauses over again, as if hoping the words would magically change. Then he flipped to the final page and stared at Julian and his notarized signature at the bottom. "What does it say?" Julian snapped, his patience wearing thin. "Stop reading and tell her we are taking the company." The attorney slowly lowered the document to the table. He did not look at me. He looked at Carter. Carter offered him a razor-thin corporate smile. As you can clearly see, Counselor Carter said, her voice smooth and lethal. My client and her husband executed a comprehensive post-nuptial agreement 36 months ago. Section 4, paragraph 2, explicitly isolates all corporate holdings and private equity assets. Your client waived all rights to spousal support, all rights to asset discovery, and all rights to equitable distribution of Apex acquisitions. Hi is entitled to exactly 50% of their shared joint checking account, which I believe currently holds a balance of $412. Julian froze. His eyes darted from Carter to his attorney. What is she talking about? Julian demanded, his voice pitching up with sudden panic. I never signed a post-nup. She is lying. Tell her she is lying. The attorney slowly pushed the yellowed folder back toward Julian. He pointed a trembling finger at the signature line on the final page. That is your signature, Julian, the attorney said, his voice hollow and defeated. It is fully authenticated and legally notarized. You signed away your rights to everything she owns. You isolated your assets to protect yourself from her business, but the language is reciprocal. It protects her business from you. Julian stared at his own signature. I watched the memory of that night in our kitchen wash over his face. I watched him realize that his need to belittle me, his desperate attempt to make me feel like a financial burden, had been the exact weapon I used to completely destroy him. There has to be a loophole, Julian gasped, grabbing the paper and shaking it. You are a lawyer. Find a loophole. Claim I signed it under duress. Claim she hid her assets when the agreement was drafted. Break the contract. The attorney shook his head slowly, stepping away from the table. We cannot break this, Julian. The language is ironclad. It explicitly waives the requirement for prior asset disclosure. You signed a blind separation agreement. There is no case here. The sleazy lawyer looked around the beautiful, expensive boardroom. He had clearly taken Julian and his case on a contingency basis, expecting to walk away with a massive percentage of a multi-million-dollar divorce settlement. Now he realized he was representing an unemployed, disgraced man who was entitled to absolutely nothing. The lawyer reached down and snapped his scuffed leather briefcase shut. The loud click echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "Where are you going?" Julian shouted as the attorney turned toward the heavy oak doors. "You work for me. You are supposed to fight for my half of the company." "I cannot represent you," Julian, the attorney said, not even bothering to look back. "I am withdrawing as your counsel, effective immediately. Good luck." The heavy doors swung shut, leaving Julian completely and utterly alone. He stood at the edge of the long marble table, his chest heaving, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. The reality of his absolute ruin was finally crushing the last remnants of his ego into dust. He had no job because I had fired him. He had no safety net because I owned the debt on his mother and her house. And now the massive divorce payout he thought would save his life had vanished into thin air. He had nothing. He was nothing. Julian stared at me, his bloodshot eyes filling with thick, heavy tears. His legs gave out beneath him. The man who had spent 5 years treating me like a charity case. The man who had locked my credit card in a bridal boutique just to teach me a lesson. Physically dropped to his knees on the cold marble floor of my boardroom. "Maya, please," Julian begged, his voice breaking into a pathetic, sobbing whine. "Please do not do this to me. I have nothing left. My firm is gone. My mother is losing her home. I cannot start over from nothing." I looked down at him, resting my chin on my folded hands. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no sorrow. The well of my compassion for this man had run completely dry. "We are still a family," Maya, Julian cried, crawling forward a few inches on his knees until he was close to the edge of my table. "I made a mistake. I was stressed. I was arrogant. But I love you. We built a life together. You cannot just throw me away. Give me a second chance. I will do whatever you want. I will work for you. Just please do not leave me with nothing." I stared at his tear-stained face, watching him weaponize the concept of family just to save his own skin. He did not love me. He loved the comfort I provided. He loved the power he thought he had over me. And now that the power was gone, he was willing to beg like a dog just to stay inside the castle I built. I reached out my hand, extending my fingers toward the sleek silver intercom console embedded in the center of the marble table. I did not break eye contact with my husband as I pressed the button. "Security," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Escort this trespasser out. 2 weeks passed since I watched my security team drag my husband out of my corporate boardroom. Those 14 days were the most profoundly peaceful days of my entire adult life. I moved out of the house Julian had chosen for us and purchased a luxury penthouse in Midtown Atlanta. I spent my mornings drinking coffee on a wraparound balcony that overlooked the glittering city skyline, and my afternoons expanding my real estate portfolio with absolute freedom. The heavy, suffocating weight of shrinking myself to fit into their toxic family dynamic was completely gone. But the fallout of my financial strike was still rippling through their lives. I knew it was only a matter of time before the collateral damage reached my front door. It happened on a quiet Tuesday evening. I was standing in my new kitchen pouring a glass of sparkling water when the secure intercom on my wall chimed softly. It was the concierge from the ground floor lobby. He sounded hesitant as he informed me that a woman claiming to be my sister-in-law was standing at the front desk, weeping and demanding to be led up to my residence. He said she was causing a scene and asked if I wanted him to call the police to have her removed. I looked out at the glowing Atlanta skyline and took a slow breath. "Send her up," I told the concierge. "I will handle it." I walked over to the private elevator landing that opened directly into my foyer. A few moments later, the brushed steel doors slid apart. Tasha stumbled out into my penthouse, and the sight of her was almost unrecognizable. For 5 years, Julian and his sister had projected an image of flawless, untouchable wealth. Tasha had never attended a single family event without being draped in designer labels, perfectly styled hair, and an aura of absolute superiority. The woman standing in my foyer right now looked like she had barely survived a natural disaster. Her expensive silk blouse was wrinkled and stained. Her hair was pulled into a messy, uneven knot. She was clutching an oversized canvas tote bag to her chest, like a life preserver, and her eyes were red and swollen from days of relentless crying. The perfect elite facade had been entirely shattered. When Trent realized I had the banking records proving he had embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from Valerie and her charity foundation, he did not stick around to face the consequences. He drained whatever cash he had left in his hidden accounts, packed a single suitcase, and fled the state before the federal authorities could freeze his passport. He abandoned his wife without a second thought, leaving Tasha to deal with the frozen bank accounts, the unpaid luxury car leases, and the furious calls from the charity board of directors. She had nothing. Maya, Tasha sobbed, her voice cracking the moment she saw me standing there. "Oh my God, Maya, please, you have to help me. I have nowhere else to go." She took a desperate step forward, reaching her hands out as if she wanted to hug me. I simply crossed my arms over my chest and held my ground. Tasha stopped, her hands dropping to her sides as she registered the cold, unyielding expression on my face. "Trent is gone!" Tasha cried, tears spilling over her eyelashes and running down her flushed cheeks. "He left me, Maya. The bank locked all of my credit cards because his name was on the primary accounts. The leasing office for my luxury townhome sent an eviction notice this morning because Trent stopped paying the rent 3 months ago. I do not have a dollar to my name. I cannot even buy groceries. You have to give me a loan. Just enough to get me on my feet until I figure this out." I watched her weep, feeling absolutely no sympathy. This was the same woman who had spent 5 years treating me like an uneducated peasant. This was the woman who sat at Valerie and her dining table just 2 weeks ago, rolling her eyes and mocking me when she thought I was just a broke freelancer. "I cannot help you, Tasha," I said, my voice perfectly flat and devoid of emotion. "Your financial situation is not my responsibility." Tasha gasped, her face contorting with a mixture of shock and desperate anger. "How can you say that?" she practically screamed, gripping the straps of her tote bag. "We are family, Maya. We are sisters. You cannot just leave me on the street because of what Julian and Trent did. They are the ones who lied. They are the ones who stole from my mother. I am a victim in all of this. You have millions of dollars. You own this entire building. You can afford to write me a check right now, and it would not even make a dent in your bank account. You owe me this. We are family." I let out a slow, humorless laugh that echoed against the high ceilings of my penthouse foyer. "Family," I repeated, the word tasting like poison on my tongue. "You want to talk about family, Tasha? Let us talk about it." I took a deliberate step toward her, closing the distance between us. Tasha flinched, backing up slightly against the elevator doors. "You did not call me your sister when you used to invite your wealthy friends over to Valerie and her estate. Just so you could all sit on the patio and make jokes about my sensible sedan parked in the driveway, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You did not call me family when you purposefully spilled red wine on the only nice dress I owned at the country club Christmas gala because you thought I did not belong in the same room as you. You spent 5 years whispering to your mother that Julian married down. You spent 5 years treating me like the hired help. But I did not know, Tasha sobbed, shaking her head frantically. I did not know you were successful. Julian told us you were struggling. If I had known you owned an acquisitions firm, I would have treated you differently. And that is exactly the problem, Tasha, I replied, staring directly into her terrified eyes. You only respect people when you think they have more power than you. You only care about me now because I am the one holding the checkbook. You are not sorry for how you treated me. You are just sorry that your gravy train ran out and you finally have to face the real world. Tasha let out a loud, pathetic wail, dropping her face into her hands. Maya, please, she begged, sinking down slightly against the polished wood paneling of the elevator frame. I will do anything. I will pay you back with interest. Just give me a place to stay. Give me something. I have never had to work a real job before. Trent always took care of the bills. I do not know how to survive out there. I stood silently and watched her cry for a long moment. I thought about the absolute cruelty she had inflicted on me over the years. I thought about the smug satisfaction on her face when she thought I was being put in my place by her brother. She wanted a handout. She wanted me to rescue her from a mess she had willingly ignored as long as it funded her designer wardrobe. I turned away from her and walked over to the sleek marble console table sitting near the entryway of my penthouse. I opened the top drawer and pulled out a single crisp piece of printed paper. Tasha looked up through her tears, a sudden spark of hope igniting in her eyes. She thought I was getting my checkbook. She thought her tears had finally broken through my defenses, and that I was going to write her a massive check to make her go away. She wiped her face and stood up straighter, taking a shaky step forward. I walked back over to the elevator and held the piece of paper out to her. Tasha reached out and took it, her hands trembling with eager anticipation. She looked down at the document. It was not a check. It was not a wire transfer authorization. It was a standard 2-page employment application. Tasha stared at the paper, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. What is this? She asked, her voice dropping to a confused whisper. My holding company recently acquired a commercial retail plaza in South Atlanta. I explained, my tone entirely professional and completely cold. One of the tenant businesses is a 24-hour discount grocery store. They are currently looking to fill an entry-level cashier position. The pay is $14 an hour. Tasha stopped breathing. She looked from the job application to my face, her expression twisting into a mask of pure, absolute horror. You want me to work as a cashier? She gasped. Maya, I cannot work at a grocery store. I have a degree in communications. I am a member of the Atlanta Botanical Society. I cannot stand on my feet ringing up produce. I reached past her and pressed the glowing button on the wall to summon the elevator back to my floor. You said you wanted me to treat you like family, Tasha, I said smoothly, as the brushed steel doors slid open behind her. Well, in my actual family, we do not hand out free rides to people who refuse to respect us. We work for what we have. Tasha stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to find the words to argue. But there was nothing left to say. I had stripped away the final illusion she clung to. I was not her savior, and I was definitely not her victim anymore. I gestured toward the open elevator doors. Family works hard. Tasha, I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. Fill out the application. Your shift starts at 6 in the morning. I took a step back and watched as Tasha mechanically stumbled backward into the elevator car, still clutching the paper in her trembling hands. She was completely broken, entirely stripped of the unearned arrogance that had defined her entire adult life. I did not break eye contact with her as the heavy steel doors slowly slid shut, cutting off her terrified, weeping face and sealing her out of my world forever. 2 days after, Tasha took that elevator ride down to reality. My legal team notified me of a new development. Valerie was not packing her bags. Instead, she was doing what she had always done when cornered by her own failures. She was spinning a narrative. Her entire existence, her absolute sense of superiority was anchored to one specific place, the Oak Ridge Country Club. It was a prestigious, historically black institution in Atlanta, a place where old money mingled and reputations were fiercely guarded. Valerie had been a member for 3 decades, and she was using that platform to launch a desperate, calculated smear campaign against me. According to my contacts on the board, Valerie was telling everyone who would listen that I was a criminal. She claimed I had forged legal documents, engaged in massive corporate fraud, and was currently under active federal investigation. She told the elite women of her social circle that I was a deranged gold digger, attempting to steal her generational wealth out of pure spite. She wanted me blacklisted from polite society. She wanted to ensure that when the sheriff finally arrived to evict her from that foreclosed estate, she could play the role of the tragic victim martyred by a psychotic, jealous daughter-in-law. She thought she had the home court advantage. She thought Oak Ridge was her impenetrable fortress. But she did not understand that I did not just play the game. I owned the board. The club was hosting its annual summer gala that Saturday night. It was the most important event on their social calendar, a night of opulent gowns, expensive champagne, and high society networking. For 5 years I had attended these galas in modest, sensible dresses, picked out by Julian standing quietly in the corner, while Valerie paraded me around as her son and his charity case. She used to introduce me with backhanded compliments, making sure everyone knew I was just a struggling freelancer who got lucky. Not tonight. Tonight I was dressing for a funeral, her social funeral. I hired a private stylist and stepped into a custom emerald green silk gown that fit like liquid glass. I wore diamonds that cost more than the luxury cars parked in the Oak Ridge valet lot. I looked in the mirror of my penthouse and said goodbye to the quiet, submissive woman Julian had tried to build. She was gone forever. My chauffeur pulled my Maybach up to the grand entrance of the Oak Ridge Country Club. The valet rushed forward, opening my door with a white-gloved hand. I stepped out into the warm evening air, the heavy silk of my gown sweeping against the pristine cobblestone. The club was magnificent, an antebellum-style mansion, radiating with the soft glow of crystal chandeliers and the melodic sounds of a live jazz band playing in the grand ballroom. I walked up the sweeping staircase, exuding a quiet, absolute power. I walked through the heavy wooden doors and into the grand ballroom. The energy in the room immediately shifted. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The elite members of Atlanta and its high society stared at me, trying to reconcile the quiet, plain girl they remembered with the woman commanding the room right now. And then I saw her. Valerie was standing near the center of the room, holding a flute of champagne, surrounded by her wealthy friends. She was wearing a dramatic silver gown, holding court, and undoubtedly in the middle of another fabricated tale about my supposed crimes. She tossed her head back in a practiced laugh, and then her eyes caught mine. The color drained from Valerie and her face so fast she looked like she might collapse. Her shock lasted only a second before it was replaced by pure, venomous rage. Her perfect social mask shattered. She slammed her champagne glass down onto a passing waiter and his tray and marched directly toward me. Her friends trailed behind her, eager to witness the drama unfold. "What are you doing here?" Valerie hissed, her voice trembling with anger, but kept just low enough to maintain her Southern belle facade. "You are not a member, Maya. Julian revoked your guest privileges days ago. You have absolutely no right to step foot in this club." I simply smiled at her, taking a slow sip from a glass of sparkling water a waiter had handed me. "It is a beautiful gala, Valerie," I said, keeping my voice perfectly relaxed. "The floral arrangements are particularly stunning this year. I have always loved white orchids." "Do not play games with me, you little fraud!" Valerie snapped, her volume rising, causing more heads to turn in our direction. "I have told the board exactly what you are. I have exposed your criminal behavior to everyone in this room. You are not going to steal my home and then crash my social events." She turned aggressively toward a nearby security guard, waving her hand with frantic entitlement. "Security, get over here right now. This woman is trespassing. She is under federal investigation. I want her escorted off the premises immediately." The heavy-set security guard stepped forward, looking incredibly uncomfortable. He reached for the radio on his shoulder, preparing to call for backup to handle the disturbance. The room had gone dead silent. Dozens of wealthy, influential people were watching, waiting to see me humiliated and dragged out the door just like Valerie promised. But before the guard could unclip his radio, a booming, authoritative voice cut through the rising tension. "Stand down, security." The voice belonged to Carlton, the distinguished president of the Oak Ridge Country Club. Carlton was a highly respected retired judge, a man whose word was absolute law within these walls. He was walking briskly across the ballroom floor, making a direct line for our tense little circle. Valerie puffed out her chest, looking at Carlton with a triumphant, arrogant smirk. "Thank goodness you are here, Carlton," Valerie said, smoothing her expensive silver dress and gesturing toward me with sheer disgust. "Maya just barged in here uninvited. I was just having her removed for trespassing. You know about the fraud she committed against my family." Carlton did not even look at Valerie. He walked straight past her, completely ignoring her outstretched hand and her indignant demands. He stopped directly in front of me, a warm, genuine smile breaking across his dignified face. He extended his hand and grasped mine in a firm, respectful handshake. "Maya," Carlton said, his voice projecting clearly across the suddenly silent ballroom, ensuring that every single person in attendance heard him. "It is an absolute honor to finally have you here in your true capacity. On behalf of the entire board of directors, I want to personally thank you for stepping in to save this club." Valerie gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. She staggered back a step, looking back and forth between me and the club president, her eyes wide with total incomprehension. Her wealthy friends began murmuring amongst themselves, confused by the sudden display of reverence. "Save the club!" Valerie repeated, her voice shaking violently. "Carlton, what are you talking about? She is a fraud. She is a criminal. You cannot shake her hand." Carlton finally turned to look at her, his expression turning instantly icy. "Valerie, you have been spreading malicious lies and baseless rumors all week," he said, his tone reprimanding her like a misbehaving child. "The board has tolerated your outbursts out of respect for your late husband and his legacy. But I will not stand here and allow you to disrespect our primary benefactor." I turned my attention back to my mother-in-law, setting my water glass down on a nearby cocktail table. The sweet taste of absolute victory sat heavy on my tongue. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to her, letting my emerald gown brush against her designer shoes. She looked small now. Stripped of her lies, stripped of her son, and his money, she was just a bitter, desperate woman realizing the world no longer bowed to her. "I told you I buy distressed assets, Valerie," I said, my voice soft but echoing with undeniable power. "Oak Ridge has been quietly defaulting on its massive land lease for the past 2 years. The bank was running out of patience. They were going to foreclose, pave over your precious historic golf course, and turn this entire property into a commercial parking garage." I looked at Valerie and smiled. I just bought the country club and its underlying land lease. The absolute silence in the grand ballroom was deafening. The live jazz band had slowly stopped playing their instruments, sensing the heavy, catastrophic shift in the atmosphere. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes ceased entirely. Every single member of the Atlanta high society elite stood perfectly still, watching the undeniable destruction of their reigning matriarch. Valerie stood frozen, her mouth slightly parted, her eyes darting frantically between my calm face and the stern, uncompromising expression of the club president. She looked like a woman who had just been told the earth was no longer spinning. The designer silver gown she wore suddenly seemed to hang off her frame like a cheap costume. "You bought the land lease," Valerie whispered, her voice trembling so badly the words barely formed. She shook her head, taking a clumsy step backward. No, that is impossible. This club is a historic institution. It belongs to the legacy members. It belongs to families like mine. You are just a brand consultant, Maya. You do not have the kind of capital to buy out a commercial land lease in this zip code." Carlton folded his hands firmly in front of him, stepping slightly to the side to give me the floor. "It is completely, entirely true, Valerie," he said, his voice carrying the heavy weight of a judge delivering a final sentence. "The board of directors held an emergency vote yesterday morning. Apex Acquisitions settled our outstanding debts with the primary lenders and purchased the master lease. Maya is not just a member. She is the landlord of this entire estate." Valerie let out a sharp, ragged gasp. She looked around desperately, seeking an ally in the sea of wealthy faces surrounding us. She looked at her closest friends, the women she had gossiped with, the women she had invited to her home to mock my modest clothes and my sensible car. She reached her hand out toward a woman named Beatrice, a fellow board member who usually echoed Valerie and her every command. Beatrice, tell him, Valerie pleaded, her voice pitching into a hysterical whine. Tell Carlton he is making a mistake. Julian is going to hear about this. Julian handles the premium portfolios for half the people in this room. He will pull his investments. He will ruin this club. Beatrice did not reach out to take her hand. Instead, the older woman took a very deliberate step backward, physically distancing herself from Valerie. Beatrice lowered her gaze, avoiding eye contact completely. Everyone in that room knew how money worked, and they all recognized that the power dynamic had permanently shifted. The golden boy Julian was no longer the shield Valerie could hide behind. Julian is not pulling investments for anyone, Valerie, I said, keeping my voice smooth and conversational. Julian was terminated from his firm yesterday afternoon. He is currently unemployable, blacklisted from the financial sector, and scrambling to avoid a massive federal audit. He cannot save you tonight. Valerie brought a trembling hand up to her throat, clutching her pearl necklace, as if it could somehow protect her from the reality crashing down on her shoulders. She was completely trapped. The impenetrable social fortress she had used to belittle me for 5 long years had just locked its gates, and I was the one holding the only key. I turned my attention to the club general manager, a sharp, meticulous man who had been hovering near Carlton. Mr. Sterling, I said, offering him a polite nod. Could you please bring up the club financial ledger on your tablet? I have a brief inquiry regarding the current status of the premium membership accounts. Mr. Sterling stepped forward immediately, tapping the screen of his tablet. Of course, Madam Chairman, he said, the new title rolling off his tongue with absolute respect. I have the ledger open. How can I assist you? Valerie swallowed hard, her eyes locking onto the glowing screen of the tablet. I watched the sheer panic flood her features. She knew exactly what I was about to do. I would like you to review the account balance for Valerie. I requested, taking another slow step forward until I was standing right in front of my mother-in-law. Could you please read aloud the current standing of her monthly dues and her outstanding gala assessments? Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses and scrolled down the screen. He cleared his throat. The account under her name is currently heavily delinquent, he stated, his voice projecting clearly into the silent ballroom. The monthly membership dues have not been paid in 8 consecutive months. Furthermore, the mandatory assessments for the spring charity luncheon and tonight and its gala have been repeatedly returned for insufficient funds. The total outstanding balance is $34,500. A collective shocked murmur rippled through the crowd of elite guests. In this particular society, hiding a lack of funds was considered bad, but being publicly exposed as a freeloader was an absolute unforgivable social crime. I looked at Valerie and let a slow, knowing smile spread across my face. For 5 years, Valerie paraded me through this exact ballroom. She used to make me walk 2 steps behind her, introducing me to these very people as the poor girl from South Atlanta her son took pity on. She used to force me to pay for my own modest meals at the club dining room, claiming that true wealth required teaching the less fortunate how to pay their own way. All the while, she bragged loudly about her premium tier membership and the massive donations her family was making to the club foundation. She had told everyone that Julian was covering her premium membership out of his massive executive bonuses. But Julian was drowning in secret margin calls and terrible offshore investments. He had been bouncing checks to the country club for the better part of a year, leaving his mother to coast purely on her outdated legacy status and his empty, arrogant promises. They were projecting an image of black excellence while secretly drowning in extreme, humiliating debt. You have not paid your cover charge in 8 months, Valerie, I said, shaking my head with mock sympathy. You have been walking through these halls drinking expensive champagne and looking down on the service staff, all while writing bad checks. You built your entire identity on making me feel poor while you were secretly bankrupt. Valerie was shaking so violently, I thought her knees might actually give out. Tears of absolute mortification welled in her eyes, spilling over her carefully applied makeup. She looked around the room and saw the expressions of the people she worshipped. There was no pity in their eyes. There was only disgust and harsh judgment. The women she had spent decades gossiping with were now looking at her like she was a complete stranger. "Maya, please," Valerie whispered, her voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate sob. "Do not do this. Please do not do this to me in front of everyone. This club is my entire life. My husband helped build the South Wing. I am a legacy member. You cannot just throw me out." She reached out and tried to grab my wrist, her fingers trembling. I did not flinch. I did not move away. I simply looked down at her hand until she realized she had no right to touch me and slowly pulled it back. "I remember a conversation we had a long time ago, Valerie," I said, my voice dropping to a cool, steady register. "You told me I needed to learn my place. You told me that I brought nothing to this family but a freelance hobby, and that I needed to respect the people who provided my lifestyle." Valerie squeezed her eyes shut, hot tears streaming down her face. "I was wrong," she cried, weeping openly in front of the silent ballroom. "I was wrong, Maya. I am sorry. Please, I will apologize to you every day. Just let me keep my membership. Do not take this away from me." I looked at the woman who had made it her personal mission to destroy my self-esteem. She was not crying because she regretted her cruelty. She was crying because her cruelty had finally met a power it could not manipulate. She was sorry she got caught. She was sorry she had no money. She was absolutely not sorry for the pain she had caused me. I turned my head and looked at the heavy-set security guard who was still standing nearby, the same guard Valerie had tried to use to throw me out just minutes earlier. "Mr. Sterling," I said, keeping my gaze fixed on the guard. "Effective immediately, please revoke this premium membership permanently. Cancel her gate access, deactivate her dining accounts, and remove her name from the legacy registry." Valerie let out a loud, shattered wail, burying her face in her hands. She collapsed slightly, leaning against a cocktail table to keep from hitting the floor. I turned back to her, my expression completely devoid of mercy. "You are living in my world now, Valerie," I said, delivering the final devastating blow. "And you cannot afford the cover charge." I nodded to the security guard. He stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Valerie and her shoulder. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gruff but polite. "I need to ask you to escort yourself off the property." Valerie looked up at me one last time, her face a mask of complete and total devastation. Her social facade, the entire foundation of her existence, was permanently, utterly destroyed. She turned away from me, sobbing heavily into her hands, and allowed the security guard to lead her through the parted crowd. The elite members of Atlanta high society watched in total silence as the former Queen of Oak Ridge was escorted across the grand ballroom, down the sweeping staircase, and out into the humid night air. Nobody said a word to her. Nobody offered her a comforting hand. She walked out of those heavy wooden doors, a completely broken, isolated woman, leaving behind the only world she had ever cared about. I stood in the center of the ballroom, adjusting the emerald silk of my custom gown. I signaled to the jazz band with a polite nod. The musicians immediately picked up their instruments, and a smooth, lively melody filled the room once again. The guests slowly resumed their conversations, casting respectful, admiring glances in my direction. I took a sip of my sparkling water, feeling the cool liquid soothe my throat. I had not yelled. I had not caused a scene. I had simply let the truth do exactly what the truth does best. It cleared the room of toxicity and left me standing entirely and beautifully alone at the very top of my empire. It had been exactly 1 month since I watched Valerie get escorted out of the Oak Ridge Country Club by security. 30 days of absolute uninterrupted peace had followed. The divorce proceedings, which Julian had arrogantly assumed would drag on for years and result in a massive payout for him, were finalized with record speed. Thanks to the airtight post-nuptial agreement he had signed without reading 3 years ago, he walked away with absolutely nothing. No alimony was granted. No real estate was divided. He did not get a single cent of the empire I had quietly built while he was busy trying to make me feel small. His professional life had imploded just as spectacularly as his personal life. The financial sector in Atlanta is a small, unforgiving world. Once word spread through the corporate grapevine that his reckless offshore gambling had nearly tanked a premier wealth management firm, Julian was permanently blacklisted. No reputable firm anywhere in the Southeast would even look at his resume. His licenses were under review, and his professional network had completely abandoned him. The golden boy, who used to lecture me on the principles of compound interest, had lost his shine, his status, and his income all in one single afternoon. I was not sitting around thinking about him, though. I was too busy expanding my footprint in the city. Apex Acquisitions had just closed a lucrative deal on a massive commercial retail plaza in the northern suburbs. It was a mid-tier outdoor shopping center, anchored by a few major national retailers and several high-end specialty shops. I decided to do a surprise site visit on a Tuesday morning. I wanted to walk the property check on the commercial tenants and evaluate the ongoing maintenance contracts for myself. I wore a tailored charcoal pantsuit and carried a simple structured leather briefcase projecting the quiet authority of a landlord surveying her newly acquired domain. The Georgia heat was already building outside, but the air conditioning inside the anchor stores was running perfectly. I walked into the plaza and its largest electronics retailer. It was a massive, brightly lit store filled with rows of televisions, premium computers, and mobile accessories. I was doing a mental checklist of the ceiling tiles and the floor fixtures, ensuring the property management team was doing their job. Then a flash of movement near the back of the store caught my eye. Near the mobile accessories aisle, a man in a bright royal blue polo shirt and khaki pants was stocking shelves. There was something immediately familiar about the rigid, tense line of his shoulders. I took a few slow steps closer, blending into the background of a large television display. It was Julian, the man who used to spend $3,000 on custom-tailored Italian suits just to attend a Sunday family dinner, was now wearing a stiff polyester uniform shirt with a plastic name tag pinned to his chest. He was holding a stack of clear plastic phone cases, mechanically sliding them onto metal pegs one by one. He looked entirely exhausted. The arrogant swagger that used to define his entire personality had been completely stripped away. His hair lacked its usual precise fade, and his posture was slumped. He looked like an ordinary struggling man working a minimum-wage retail job just trying to survive the week. I stood near the display and watched him for a long moment. I did not feel any pity for him. I did not feel any lingering anger or resentment. I just felt a profound sense of closure. This was the reality of the man who had demanded my absolute submission. Stripped of my silent capital and his mother and her stolen charity funds, he was completely unremarkable, as if sensing eyes on him. Julian turned his head. His gaze swept past the television displays and landed directly on me. I saw the exact moment his brain registered who I was. His eyes went wide and his mouth dropped open in absolute horror. He physically jolted, dropping a plastic phone case directly onto the linoleum floor. The great financial executive was completely panicked. He scrambled backward, trying to duck behind a large cardboard promotional display. He was desperate to hide his bright blue uniform and his utter humiliation from the woman he used to treat like an uneducated peasant. I wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. I could have walked away right then. I had already won the war. I owned the building he was standing in. But there was one final lesson he needed to learn about how real wealth and real power actually worked. I walked over to the nearest display rack and picked up a premium braided charging cable. Holding the small box in my hand, I made my way directly to the front checkout counter. There were 3 registers open with different employees standing behind them, but I walked straight past 2 of them. I walked right up to the register where Julian was awkwardly trying to busy himself with a stack of returned merchandise. He saw me approaching and completely froze. His hands were shaking visibly as he gripped the edge of the counter. He could not look me in the eye. He just stared down at the laminate surface, his face burning with a deep, shameful red flush that spread all the way to the tips of his ears. "Will you ring me up, Julian?" I asked, my voice perfectly polite and incredibly cold. He swallowed hard, his chest rising and falling erratically beneath his polyester polo. He reached out and took the charging cable from my hand, taking great care to avoid any physical contact with my skin. His hands trembled so violently, it took him 3 tries to properly scan the barcode beneath the red laser. The cash register beeped loudly in the quiet store, a sharp electronic sound that echoed in the space between us. "That will be $32.50. Julian mumbled, his voice barely a hollow, raspy whisper. He kept his eyes glued to the digital screen on his register. He was too humiliated to face me, too broken to acknowledge the reality of what he had become. He just waited for me to hand over some cash or swipe a standard debit card so he could finish the transaction and escape into the back room. I did not say a word. I reached into my leather briefcase and unzipped the hidden interior compartment. I bypassed my standard business cards and pulled out a heavy, solid metal black card. It was the exact same credit card he had locked in the Buckhead Bridal Boutique all those months ago. The card he had restricted because he wanted to teach me financial discipline. The card he thought he had authority over because he believed he was the undisputed king of our household. I held the cool metal between my fingers for a brief second. Then I placed the black card firmly on the counter right in front of his shaking hands. It hit the surface with a heavy, satisfying thud that made him flinch. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the counter, projecting absolute authority. "Go ahead, Julian," I said, my voice smooth and lethal. "Run the card. Let us see if it declines." The heavy, solid metal black card rested on the scuffed laminate surface of the checkout counter. Julian stared at it as though it were a physical manifestation of his own complete destruction. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow movements beneath the stiff fabric of his royal blue polyester uniform shirt. For a man who had spent the entirety of our marriage obsessing over status symbols and financial dominance, the sight of that particular card was the ultimate psychological defeat. It was the exact same account he had restricted in the bridal boutique, an account he believed he controlled. Now it sat before him, representing an empire of wealth he could not even begin to comprehend. "Pick it up, Julian," I said, my voice maintaining a perfectly calm and professional register. "Process the transaction." His jaw clenched so tightly I could see a muscle jumping in his cheek. He slowly reached out his hand, trembling as his fingers brushed the cool metal surface of the card. He avoided making any eye contact with me. He kept his gaze firmly locked on the digital screen of the cash register. He slid the card into the chip reader. The machine processed the transaction in total silence for 3 long seconds. Then a sharp, clear beep echoed through the quiet electronic store, indicating the payment had been approved. Julian mechanically tore the printed receipt from the machine. He placed it on the counter next to the small box containing the charging cable. He still refused to look up. He was entirely paralyzed by the crushing weight of his own humiliation. "Thank you for your assistance today, Julian," I said, offering a polite, businesslike nod. I picked up the small box and my credit card, sliding them both neatly into my structured leather briefcase. I turned away from the register and began walking toward the front exit of the store, my heels clicking with deliberate, measured rhythm against the polished floor. I stepped through the automatic sliding doors and out into the sweltering heat of the Atlanta afternoon. The bright Georgia sun glared down on the sprawling commercial plaza that my holding company had recently acquired. I walked toward the designated loading zone where my chauffeured Maybach was waiting with the engine running. I felt a profound sense of closure. I had surveyed my property. I had confirmed the operational status of my retail tenants, and I had looked the source of my past trauma directly in the eye without feeling a single ounce of fear. But Julian simply could not let it go. His ego was far too fragile to accept absolute defeat. He needed to have the last word. He needed to prove to himself that he still possessed some shred of superiority over me. I heard the rapid, heavy sound of his footsteps slapping against the concrete pavement behind me. He had abandoned his cash register and run out of the store, violating his employment protocols just to chase me down in the parking lot. "Maya, wait!" he shouted, his voice echoing across the open commercial plaza. I did not stop walking. I maintained my steady professional pace as I approached the sleek black vehicle waiting for me. My driver stepped out and opened the rear passenger door, standing at attention. Julian caught up to me just as I reached the vehicle. He was panting heavily, sweat beading on his forehead and staining the collar of his cheap retail uniform. He positioned himself between me and the open door of the Maybach, trying to use his physical presence to block my path. "You think you are so powerful now, do you not?" Julian sneered, his voice dripping with a bitter, desperate resentment. "You think walking into my workplace and waving your little metal credit card around changes anything. You think buying a few shopping centers makes you better than me." I looked at him with absolute calm. "Julian, please return to your register," I advised him, my tone completely devoid of emotion. You are currently on the clock and abandoning your station is a violation of your corporate policies. I am the landlord of this commercial property, and I expect the retail staff to maintain proper professional conduct. Julian let out a harsh, erratic laugh. He ran a shaking hand over his face, smearing the sweat across his brow. You can buy all the real estate in Atlanta, Maya, but you are still the exact same miserable woman I married. You have no class. You have no real pedigree. You are just hiding behind a pile of money. He pointed a trembling finger toward the far end of the parking lot. Do you see that car over there? He demanded, his voice rising with desperate arrogance. I followed his gaze. Parked in a premium spot, clearly designated for store management, was a sleek, bright silver Porsche. It was the luxury sports car he had leased during the height of his career at the wealth management firm. It was the vehicle he used to project an image of untouchable financial success. It was the only asset he had managed to retain after his professional life completely imploded. That is my car. Maya Julian bragged, puffing out his chest and attempting to stand taller. I might be working a temporary retail job right now while I rebuild my investment portfolio, but I still drive a $150,000 machine. I still have standards. I still belong to a class of people you will never truly understand. You can ride around in the back of a chauffeured car like a passenger, but I am the one holding the keys to my own life. I looked at the silver sports car gleaming in the afternoon sun. Then I looked back at the pathetic, broken man standing in front of me, desperately clinging to a leased piece of metal to validate his entire existence. I did not argue with him. I simply offered him a cool, steady smile. That is a very impressive vehicle, Julian, I noted, keeping my voice perfectly level. You should probably go and secure it. Julian smirked, believing his aggressive posturing had successfully intimidated me. He turned away from my Maybach and began marching confidently across the asphalt toward his prized possession. He pulled a sleek black key fob from his pocket, pressing the button to unlock the doors. The lights of the silver Porsche flashed twice, signaling his arrival. He reached out to grasp the driver's side door handle. At that exact moment, a massive, heavy-duty commercial tow truck turned the corner of the parking aisle. The large diesel engine roared loudly as the truck accelerated down the lane. The driver expertly maneuvered the massive vehicle, swinging it around with precision and backing it rapidly into the parking space directly behind the silver sports car. The heavy steel towing rig completely blocked the Porsche, pinning it against the concrete parking barrier. Julian froze. His hand slipped off the door handle. He spun around, his face contorting with sudden panic. "Hey, what are you doing?" Julian shouted, waving his arms at the truck. "Move that rig right now. You are blocking my car." The tow truck driver, a large man wearing a high-visibility safety vest, stepped out of the cab holding a digital tablet. He did not look intimidated by Julian and his screaming. He simply walked to the back of his truck and began operating the hydraulic controls to lower the towing arms. "I told you to stop!" Julian screamed, abandoning his professional facade completely. He marched up to the driver, pointing an aggressive finger at the man in his chest. "If you touch my vehicle, I will have you arrested for grand theft auto. I am a highly respected financial executive, and I will sue your entire company into bankruptcy." The driver did not flinch. He looked down at his digital tablet and then looked at Julian and his bright blue retail uniform shirt. "I have a legal repossession order for this vehicle, sir," the driver stated in a bored, monotone voice. "The financial lease on this asset is currently 90 days past due. The holding company authorized an immediate seizure of the property. Please step away from the vehicle so I can secure the tires." Julian stumbled backward, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. The blood drained from his face, leaving him completely pale. He had lost his job a month ago. Without his exorbitant corporate salary, he had completely depleted his savings, trying to maintain the illusion of his elite lifestyle. He had secretly defaulted on his luxury car lease, hoping he could somehow secure a new position before the bank noticed the missed payments. "You cannot take my car!" Julian gasped, his voice cracking with absolute terror. "There has been a banking error. My accounts are just temporarily frozen. I will write you a check right now. Just give me 24 hours to clear the routing numbers." "I do not take checks, sir," the driver replied, already securing the heavy metal chains around the front tires of the silver sports car. "If you have a dispute regarding the financial terms of your lease, you will need to contact the parent holding company directly. My job is just to transport the asset." Julian fell to his knees on the hot asphalt. He watched in complete horror as the hydraulic lift whined loudly, raising the front end of his pristine luxury vehicle off the ground. The last remaining symbol of his fake wealth was being physically dragged away from him in the middle of a crowded commercial parking lot. He had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. I stood by the open door of my Maybach watching the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. I stepped into the spacious, luxurious interior of my vehicle and settled into the plush leather seating. My driver closed the door, sealing me inside the quiet, climate-controlled cabin. As the tow truck began to slowly pull away, with the silver Porsche secured to the back, Julian scrambled to his feet. He looked across the parking lot and saw my vehicle preparing to depart. He realized in that agonizing moment that he was stranded. He was wearing a retail uniform, standing in the sweltering heat, with no transportation, no money, and absolutely no dignity. No. I pressed the silver button on my armrest, lowering the tinted rear window. The Maybach rolled forward smoothly, gliding past Julian as he stood paralyzed on the asphalt. He looked at me through the open window, his eyes wide with desperate, complete defeat. I looked directly into his eyes, ensuring he heard my final words with absolute clarity. "I own the private equity holding company that holds your car lease, Julian," I stated, my voice projecting calm professional authority over the rumble of the departing tow truck. "You missed your payment. Take the bus." I pressed the button again, raising the tinted glass and completely severing my connection to his world. The window sealed shut, cutting off the sound of his ragged, desperate breathing. I instructed my driver to return to the corporate headquarters, leaving my ex-husband standing alone in the empty parking lot, exactly where he belonged. 6 months passed since I left my ex-husband standing in the blistering heat of that commercial parking lot, watching his leased sports car get towed away. 6 months of absolute uninterrupted and unbothered peace. The grueling, suffocating weight of shrinking my entire existence to fit inside the narrow confines of his fragile ego was completely gone. I had spent half a decade playing the role of the quiet, submissive wife, nodding along while his family mocked my background and belittled my career. Now I was standing at the absolute pinnacle of the empire I had built entirely on my own terms. Tonight, the heavy, humid air of Atlanta was kept at bay by the towering glass walls of the downtown Museum of Art. I was hosting the inaugural philanthropic gala for a new foundation I had built from the ground up. This was not like Valerie and her fake heritage charity, which Trent had used as a personal piggy bank to fund luxury shopping sprees and sports cars. This was a fully funded, actively operating mentorship program designed specifically to provide venture capital and elite business training for young African American women entrepreneurs. I wanted to be the safety net and the springboard that I always wished I had when I was first starting out. I walked through the grand atrium of the museum, projecting a quiet but absolute power. I was no longer hiding behind the sensible cardigans and understated dresses Julian used to pick out for me. I wore a custom floor-length gown of deep sapphire silk that moved like water with every step I took. Delicate diamond drops rested against my collarbones, catching the soft ambient light of the museum. I did not have to walk 2 steps behind anyone tonight. I was the center of gravity in the room. The space was filled with genuine power and authentic community. There were no petty country club socialites whispering behind their champagne glasses. There were no arrogant junior partners bragging about leveraged offshore investments. The room was packed with brilliant, dedicated professionals. My lead corporate counsel, Carter, was standing near the grand staircase laughing warmly with my private wealth manager, Harrison. They were surrounded by city officials, prominent business leaders, and the very women this entire event was designed to uplift. I stopped near a display of contemporary sculptures where a young woman in her mid-20s was waiting nervously. She was one of the first recipients of my foundation and its venture capital grants. She had developed an innovative logistics software platform, but had been repeatedly denied funding by traditional banking institutions who could not see past her youth and her background. I recognized the exact look of determination and exhaustion in her eyes because it was the same look I used to see in the mirror every single morning. Sue began to pitch me a new expansion idea for her platform, her hands moving quickly as she explained the profit margins and the projected user growth. I did not interrupt her. I did not talk over her or dismiss her ambitions as a cute little freelance hobby. I listened to every single word she said, giving her my complete and undivided attention. When she finished, she took a shaky breath, bracing herself for rejection or condescension. I smiled and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Your projection models are incredibly sound," I told her, my voice steady and supportive. "Do not ever let anyone tell you to lower your asking price. You know the value of your product and you know the value of your own mind. The foundation will approve the additional funding tomorrow morning. I want you to scale this as big as you possibly can." The young woman burst into tears of pure joy, throwing her arms around me in a tight, genuine embrace. That single moment of lifting someone else up was worth more than every single dollar Julian and his family had ever tried to hoard. I excused myself from the main atrium, needing a moment to simply breathe and take in the magnitude of the evening. I walked down a quiet marble corridor and pushed open a set of heavy glass doors, stepping out onto the expansive private balcony of the museum. The warm evening air wrapped around me, carrying the faint, distant sounds of city traffic. I walked to the edge of the balcony, resting my hands on the cool stone railing, and looked out over the glittering Atlanta skyline. The city was a sprawling ocean of light and glass, and I essentially owned a massive piece of it. From where I stood, I could see the glowing logo of the commercial tower where Apex Acquisitions was headquartered. I could see the financial district where Julian had completely ruined his career, trying to play a game he did not understand. I could see the distant outline of the affluent suburbs, where Valerie had been formally evicted from her foreclosed estate, losing the only thing that gave her a sense of identity. I stood there in the quiet darkness and reflected on the sheer psychological toll of the past 5 years. I thought about how deeply society conditions women, especially successful African American women, to diminish our own light so we do not blind the men around us. I had convinced myself that keeping my wealth a secret was an act of love. I had convinced myself that protecting Julian from my success was the only way to maintain peace in our home. I had allowed Valerie to insult my upbringing and mock my career because I thought family required endless, infinite compromise. But shrinking myself had almost cost me my entire soul. It had not made them love me more. It had only made them respect me less. They saw my humility as weakness, and they tried to exploit it. They built a house of cards on the foundation of my silent capital, and then they had the absolute audacity to tell me I did not belong inside it. The false family was completely gone now, erased from my life with clinical legal precision. But I was not lonely. I was surrounded by a chosen family of loyal business partners, genuine friends, and a community I was actively working to empower. I had lost a toxic marriage, but I had gained the entire world. The soft click of a door opening broke me out of my thoughts. I turned my head slightly as a well-dressed woman stepped onto the balcony holding a digital audio recorder. She was a senior reporter from a highly respected national financial publication. She had been requesting an exclusive interview with me all evening, trying to understand the sudden emergence of my corporate empire. "Madam Chairman," the reporter said, her voice respectful as she approached the stone railing. "I apologize for interrupting your evening. It is a spectacular gala, and the work your foundation is doing is truly unprecedented in this city." "Thank you," I replied, turning to face her with a polite professional smile. "I believe that when you acquire significant resources, it becomes your absolute duty to hold the door open for the people coming up behind you." The reporter nodded, pressing the record button on her device. "That is exactly what I wanted to ask you about," she said, leaning against the railing. "The financial sector is completely fascinated by your trajectory. For years, Apex Acquisitions was acquiring massive commercial properties, distressed debt portfolios, and premier real estate completely under the radar. You built a billion-dollar private equity firm in total absolute silence. Most executives in your position demand constant media attention and public recognition. How did you manage to build such a massive, untouchable empire so quietly?" I looked back out over the glowing skyline of the city, listening to the faint melodic sound of the jazz band drifting out from the museum ballroom. I thought about the bridal boutique, the declined credit card, and the arrogant voice of a man who thought he could control my destiny by cutting off my allowance. I turned my gaze back to the reporter, looking her directly in the eye with a slow, satisfied smile. Because people see exactly what they want to see. I said, my voice smooth, calm, and echoing with absolute, undeniable power. When people look down on you when they are blinded by their own arrogance and their desperate need to feel superior, they stop paying attention to what you are actually doing. They are so busy trying to keep you in your place that they leave all the doors wide open. And when people underestimate you, they hand you the keys to the castle without even realizing it. The reporter thanked me for my time, closing her notebook with a look of profound respect. I offered her a warm smile and turned away from the stone railing of the balcony, leaving the cool night air behind me. As I walked back through the heavy glass doors and into the grand atrium of the museum, the vibrant sounds of the gala washed over me. The jazz band was playing a lively, upbeat melody, and the room was filled with the beautiful, resonant sound of genuine laughter. I moved through the crowd, gliding past towering floral arrangements and stunning contemporary sculptures. Everywhere I looked, I saw Black excellence that was absolutely authentic. There were no false facades here tonight. There were no arrogant men pretending to be financial titans while drowning in secret margin calls. There were no bitter matriarchs clutching their pearls and judging the people around them just to hide their own bankruptcies. Atlanta is a very small town when you fall from grace. Gossip moves faster than a wire transfer, and the city had entirely rejected the people who had tried to destroy me. As I accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter, I allowed myself a brief, satisfying moment of reflection on the current reality of my former family. Valerie was no longer the undisputed queen of the affluent suburbs. When the 30-day eviction notice expired, she was forced to pack whatever belongings she could fit into a rented moving truck and leave her pristine estate forever. She now lived in a very modest, aging duplex on the far outskirts of the city. The women she used to invite over for expensive wine and malicious gossip completely stopped taking her calls. The country club elite pretended they had never even met her. She spent her days entirely isolated, sitting in a cramped living room, clinging to photo albums of a society that had permanently erased her from their memory. Tasha had actually surprised me. When Trent abandoned her to dodge the federal embezzlement investigation, she realized that her tears and her unearned entitlement were not going to pay the rent. She swallowed her immense pride and took the entry-level job I offered her. My property managers reported that she clocks in at the discount grocery store at exactly 6 o'clock every single morning. She wears a plain uniform smock, and she stands on her feet for 8 hours a day, ringing up produce and bagging groceries for the very people she used to look down on. She was completely humbled, stripped of her designer bags and her luxury cars, but she was surviving. She was finally learning the true value of a dollar the hard way. And then there was Julian, my former husband. The man who used to lecture me about financial discipline was currently living in a tiny, poorly ventilated studio apartment right beneath the flight path of the international airport. He was drowning under the crushing weight of the massive debts he had accumulated trying to maintain his fake lifestyle. Because he was permanently blacklisted from the financial sector, he was trapped in that minimum wage retail job, wearing a polyester uniform and riding the city bus to work every single day. I pictured him sitting in his sweltering, cramped apartment, staring at his hands and realizing that he had thrown away a lifetime of absolute freedom and infinite wealth, simply because his ego was too fragile to stand next to a powerful woman. He had demanded my submission, and in return the universe had handed him a lifetime of absolute irrelevance. I took a slow sip of my water, bringing my attention back to the beautiful, glittering reality I had built for myself. The gala was slowly winding down. The mentorship program was fully endowed, and the silent auction had raised more capital than my legal team had even projected. The young women entrepreneurs I had spoken to throughout the night were leaving the museum with venture capital grants, business plans, and a community of support that would permanently change the trajectory of their lives. Carter, my lead corporate attorney, walked over to me with a wide, genuine smile. She raised her glass in a silent toast, acknowledging the absolute triumph of the evening. Harrison, my private wealth manager, gave me a respectful nod from across the room. I was surrounded by people who did not want to shrink my light. They wanted to see exactly how bright I could shine. As the final guests began to gather their coats and say their goodbyes, the event manager of the museum approached me. He was a distinguished older man, wearing a sharp tuxedo and carrying a polished silver tray. "Madam Chairman," he said, his voice deeply respectful as he stopped a few feet away. "I want to personally thank you for choosing our museum for this historic gala. It has been an absolute honor to host your foundation tonight." "Thank you for your impeccable service," I replied, offering him a warm, gracious smile. "The venue was flawless and your catering staff exceeded every expectation." The manager bowed his head slightly. "I have the final invoice for the catering, the venue securing, and the additional staffing," he explained, extending the silver tray toward me. It was a massive sum representing an evening of uncompromised luxury and elite service. I did not flinch at the number. I simply set my water glass down on a nearby cocktail table and reached into the hidden zipper compartment of my structured evening bag. My fingers brushed past my lipstick and my car keys until they found the heavy, familiar weight of my credit card. I pulled out the solid metal black card, the exact same card Julian had tried to lock all those months ago. The card that represented the quiet, unstoppable empire I had built entirely in the shadows. I placed the cool, heavy metal onto the silver tray. The event manager looked at the premium card and then looked up at me with a polite, professional smile. "Would you like me to run this as credit, Ma?" he asked, pulling a digital payment terminal from his jacket pocket. I stood there in the center of the grand atrium, bathed in the soft glow of the crystal chandeliers. I thought about the years I spent making myself small to fit into rooms that were never built for me. I thought about the sheer terror I used to feel whenever my phone rang, and the absolute unbothered peace that now filled my entire soul. I was wealthy, I was respected, and above all else, I was completely and utterly free. I looked at the manager and let a slow, brilliant smile spread across my face. "No," I said, my voice ringing with absolute perfect clarity. "I own the bank. Just put it on my tab." The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that shrinking yourself to protect someone else and their fragile ego will never buy you their respect. For 5 years, I dimmed my own light. I hid my success, my wealth, and my ambition because I was conditioned to believe that keeping the peace meant sacrificing my own power. But toxic people do not value your sacrifices, they only exploit your silence. True freedom begins the moment you stop seeking validation from people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You do not owe your loyalty to a family that only sees you as a stepping stone or a punching bag. Sometimes the most profound act of self-love is walking away from the table where you are being starved and choosing to build your own empire from the ground up. When they underestimate you, they give you the ultimate advantage. Let them think you are weak. Let them think you are struggling. Because the moment you finally stop playing by their rules, you will realize you had the keys to the castle all along. Have you ever had to hide your true potential to keep the peace in a toxic relationship? Let me know in the comments below, and please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about women taking back their power.